The door didn't close behind her. It was thrown shut, the bolt driven home by her own father's hand while she still stood on the porch, her bag barely on her shoulder, the sky still black. "Don't come back," he said. Not shouted. Said. Quietly. Like she was already nothing. Clara Whitmore was 19 years old, and in less than 60 seconds, she had been erased. If this story moves you, subscribe, hit that bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The bolt hit the frame at 4:47 in the morning. Clara heard it, that final hollow click, and for 3 full seconds, she just stood there on the porch of the house she'd grown up in. Not moving, not breathing. Listening to the silence that followed, like a held breath before a scream. The lantern light from inside bled through the crack at the bottom of the door. Thin gold, almost warm. Then it went out. She stared at the dark wood. She had been born in that house. She had taken her first steps on those floorboards. She had sat at that kitchen table every morning of her life, watching her father eat his breakfast in silence while the ranch hands moved around outside like shadows belonging to someone else's world. And now she was on the wrong side of the door. Her bag was light. She hadn't had time to pack much. A change of clothes, a tin of dried biscuits she'd swiped from the pantry shelf, a small leather purse with $11.40 inside every coin she'd saved over 2 years of keeping the household accounts. Her boots weren't laced all the way. Her coat was her mother's old one, the gray one with the fraying cuff, and it smelled like cedar, and something she couldn't name anymore, something that used to mean home. She didn't knock again. She knew better. 3 hours earlier, the dining room had been lit up like a courthouse. Thomas Whitmore sat at the head of the table. He always sat at the head of the table, and he had the look on his face that Clara had learned to read before she could read words. The look that said someone is about to be punished. His jaw set hard, his hands flat on the table, his eyes moving from her face to the letter that lay open between them, then back again. The letter she had written to the county land office. The letter that had never been meant for him to find. "Read it to me," he said. "Father, read it, out loud." She swallowed. Her hands were shaking, but she pressed them flat against her skirt so he wouldn't see. "I wrote it on behalf of the families in Dry Creek Hollow. They're being—" "I know what they're being." His voice was quiet. That was the dangerous sign. When Thomas Whitmore got loud, it passed. When he got quiet, it stayed. "I want you to read me your words. What you wrote. What you sent under this family's name." "I didn't sign your name." "You signed Clara Whitmore. You think that's different." He tapped the letter with 2 fingers slowly, the way a judge taps a gavel. "You think people in this county don't know whose daughter you are." She made herself look at him. That was another thing she had learned young: never look away from Thomas Whitmore when he was building to something. It only made it worse. "Those families have been on that land for 15 years. You're evicting 12 of them before harvest. They'll have nothing going into winter. That land is mine. The land is yours. Those people are people." The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded the way a rifle is loaded. She could feel her stepmother Vera sitting at the far end of the table without looking at her, still and careful. The way Vera always was when Thomas got like this, present but invisible, breathing, but not speaking, her teacup, held with both hands, like a shield that wouldn't stop anything. "You have embarrassed this family," Thomas said, still quiet. "You have gone behind my back. You have involved yourself in business that has nothing to do with you, and you have done it all with my name." "I was trying to—" "I don't care what you were trying to do." He stood up. Thomas Whitmore was not a tall man, but he had the kind of presence that filled a room the way smoke fills a room, gradually and then completely. "You are my daughter. Your job in this house is to represent this family with dignity and with obedience. And you have failed at both." Clara felt the heat come up her neck. Not shame. Anger. And that was always the problem. She'd never been able to make herself feel ashamed when she knew she was right, and Thomas had never been able to forgive her for it. "I'm not going to apologize," she said. The room went very still. Even Vera set her cup down. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not rage, not grief. Something older and colder than either of those things. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of something that has been building for a long time and has finally arrived. "Then you're not going to stay," he said. She'd thought even then, even standing in that dining room with her father's words hanging in the air like wood smoke, she'd thought it was a threat. The kind of thing people say in the heat of a fight that dissolves by morning. She'd gone into her room. She'd sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, heart beating too fast, waiting for it to pass. It didn't pass. At 4 in the morning, the knock at her bedroom door wasn't her father. It was Abel Price, the ranch foreman, a big, quiet man with a gray beard and eyes that never held anything that looked like cruelty. He'd worked for the Whitmore Ranch since before Clara was born. He stood in the doorway holding a lantern, and he didn't quite look at her. "I want you gone before sunrise, Miss Clara," Abel said. His voice was low and rough and held something in it she had never heard from him before. Something that might have been shame if a man like Abel Price allowed himself that. "I'm sorry. I am. But he means it this time." She had looked at him for a long moment. "He always means it, Abel." "Yes, ma'am. But this time he told me to make sure of it." She hadn't cried. She wanted to remember that later, that she hadn't cried in front of Abel. Price hadn't cried while she packed her bag with hands that shook and a chest that ached so bad it felt like something physical, like a wound. She had packed the way a person packs when they know they're not coming back, even if they can't fully believe it yet. Practical things. Warm things. The small leather purse. Her mother's coat. She had walked past the dining room without looking in. Past the kitchen, where the morning's fire was already set and waiting to be lit. Past the front room with its big stone fireplace and the painting above it of Thomas Whitmore on horseback looking out at land that went on as far as the painting went. She had gone out the front door, and then the bolt had hit the frame behind her. Now she walked. The road out of Red Hollow ran north before it split east toward Caldwell Flats, west toward the old mining country, north into the mountains where the passes got hard in September and impossible by November. It was the second week of September. She knew the passes. She'd ridden them once with her father years ago before things got bad between them. Before things got worse between them. Before she'd grown into someone he didn't recognize anymore, or maybe someone he recognized too well. She didn't have a horse. She had actually thought in those first stunned minutes outside the house that Abel might bring her one. That some last piece of decency in the situation would provide her with that much. It hadn't. The stable stayed dark. The hands stayed in their bunkhouse. The ranch that had housed and fed and shaped her entire existence went on existing without her smoothly, quietly, like a machine that had just had a faulty part removed. She walked. The road was dry and cold and hard under her boots. The sky to the east had the faintest gray suggestion of light, not dawn, yet just the idea of it, the promise that the dark was not permanent. She held on to that. She walked with her bag over one shoulder and her mother's coat pulled tight, and she made herself put one foot in front of the other and not look back. She looked back once, just once. The house was already small. The lamp over the porch gate had been extinguished. The whole property looked like something drawn in charcoal on dark paper shapes, edges the suggestion of a life she used to have. She turned back around and walked faster. At the edge of the Whitmore property, where the fence line met the county road, someone was leaning against the post. Clara stopped. The figure straightened. She recognized the shape of him before she saw his face, the way he stood slightly apart, the set of his shoulders, the hat pulled low. Ethan Cole had worked cattle on the Whitmore Ranch for 3 years. He was 7 years older than her, and he had the kind of quiet that came not from having nothing to say, but from having learned that saying it rarely changed anything. He wasn't handsome in the way that made people stop and stare. He was handsome in the way that crept up on you, the way you'd known him a year before you noticed it, and then you couldn't stop noticing it. She had never particularly talked to Ethan Cole. Ranch hands didn't eat at the family table. The divide between the house and the bunkhouse was one of the unspoken laws of a place like Whitmore land, and Clara had grown up understanding it the way she understood gravity, not questioning it, just living within it. But he was there, at the fence post, in the dark, at 4:30 in the morning. She stopped 6 feet from him. "What are you doing out here?" "Couldn't sleep." His voice was the same as always, low, unhurried, like a man who'd decided a long time ago there was no point in rushing words. "Heard some commotion up at the house." "Did you?" "Uh-huh." He looked at her bag, at her coat, at the road stretching north behind her. Then he looked at her face, and he didn't look away the way Abel had. He looked at her straight, and she had the unsettling feeling of being seen clearly by someone she didn't know well enough for that. "You got a plan?" "I'm working on one." "How far you figure to go on foot?" "As far as I need to." He nodded slowly, like she'd said something sensible, instead of something that was probably going to get her killed. "There's a town called Millhaven about 20 miles north up the county road. Got a boarding house, a few shops, some people there who don't owe Thomas Whitmore anything." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something. He held it out. "You'll want this." She looked at it. A small compass brass, the kind that clipped to a watch chain. She didn't take it immediately. "Why are you doing this?" I thought about that for a moment. Or maybe he didn't think about it. Maybe he just gave the question the time it deserved before answering. "Because you wrote that letter," he said finally. "Because those families in Dry Creek Hollow are real people, and you knew it, and you said it out loud when you could have kept quiet. And because nobody else is out here at 4 in the morning seeing you off." He paused. That seemed wrong to me. She took the compass. It was warm from being in his pocket. "Thank you," she said. "Miss Clara." He stopped. Started again. "Be careful on the north road. There's a stretch about 8 miles out past the old Briggs property where the tree cover gets heavy. You want to move through that fast. Don't stop in there." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because 2 days ago, 2 men came through town asking around about your father's land holdings. Asking specific questions about who has a claim on what's north of the fence line." His jaw tightened slightly. Men like that don't ask questions unless someone's paying them to ask questions. Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You think he'd—" "I think your father is a man who doesn't like unfinished business," Ethan said carefully. "And I think you being out in the world saying things he doesn't want, said makes you unfinished business." He met her eyes. "Move fast through that stretch. Don't stop for anybody who hasn't given you a reason to trust them first." She nodded. She made herself hold it together, the fear and the anger and the grief that was pressing up behind her ribs like floodwater behind a dam. She would not fall apart at a fence post in front of Ethan Cole. She would not. "I'll be fine," she said. He looked at her with those steady eyes and didn't say, "I know you will," the way a person says something they don't quite mean. He said, "I believe that." She walked. She had been walking for 2 hours when she heard the horses. She was passing the old Briggs property. She knew the collapsed fence line that marked it, the rusted gate hanging open at an angle, the outline of a farmhouse that had been empty since before she was born. She was moving fast, like Ethan had told her, keeping her eyes on the road ahead, her breathing steady and deliberate, when the sound came from somewhere behind and to the left of her. Hoofbeats. Not 1 horse. 2. Maybe 3. She didn't run. Running would be visible. Running would be noise. She turned off the road, immediately moving into the long grass beside the fence line, and went low, pressing herself against the rotting fence post, making herself still. The way her father had taught her years ago, when they used to hunt together, freeze first, then think. The hunting lessons were maybe the last useful things he'd given her. The horses passed on the road. 3 riders moving at a walk, not hurrying. She couldn't see their faces clearly in the pre-dawn dark, but she could see enough the way they rode loose and watchful. The kind of watchfulness that doesn't come from being tired or bored, but from being paid. One of them had a rifle across his lap. They didn't stop. They didn't seem to notice her. She waited until the sound of them had gone north. Then she stood up slowly, her knees unsteady, her hands gripping her bag strap until her knuckles ached. 2 days ago, 2 men came through town asking around. It had taken less than 2 days. He hadn't even waited for the sun to come up before sending men after her. She didn't know if they were there to bring her back, or to make sure she didn't make it to Millhaven to talk to anyone. She didn't know which of those possibilities was worse. She left the road. She went east into the open country, away from the tree cover, away from the road, picking her way across ground that was harder to track. It added miles. It added time. Her boots were not made for rough country, and she could feel every rock and every rut through the soles. She didn't stop. The sky was going gray, then pink, then the pale cold blue of a September dawn that doesn't promise warmth. She walked into it. She pulled her mother's coat tighter, and she kept the brass compass in her left hand, checking it every few minutes, keeping herself oriented, north, northwest, toward Millhaven, toward the idea of strangers who didn't owe Thomas Whitmore anything. She was thinking about that, about the faces of people who might look at her without already knowing who she was, and what she'd done, and what she'd been cast out for when the ground gave way. It was a dry creek bed, hidden under a crust of dried grass. She went through it suddenly, her left foot dropping 8 inches before the rest of her caught up, and she went down hard on her hands and knees in the loose dirt at the bottom. The compass flew from her hand. She knelt there for a moment, just breathing. Her palms were scraped. One knee had hit a rock and was throbbing in a way that was going to become very unpleasant very quickly. She looked up at the pale sky and had one long, pure moment of wanting to just stay there. Just stay at the bottom of the dry creek bed and not move, and not be a person who had to walk 20 miles alone across rough country with men on horseback looking for her. She let herself have that moment. Then she started looking for the compass. She found it half buried in loose dirt 2 feet away. She wiped it on her skirt, checked the needle still working, still pointing, and pulled herself out of the creek bed with her teeth clenched against the pain in her knee. She kept walking. By mid-morning, she could see Millhaven from the ridge, a small collection of buildings in the valley below, smoke coming from chimneys, the dark line of the single main street, the water tower on the east side that she recognized from a trip she'd made there years ago with her father to see the county attorney. It looked small from up here. It looked like it might contain maybe 200 people and a dog. It was the most beautiful thing she'd seen in hours. She started down the ridge. She had gone maybe 50 yards when the man stepped out from behind a stand of cedar trees directly in her path. He was big. Bigger than Abel Price, bigger than any of the Whitmore hands. He wore a brown hat pulled low and a long duster that had seen a lot of miles. He had his thumbs hooked in his belt, and he was looking at her with the careful professional attention of a man who has been doing a job and has just found the thing that job required him to find. "Clara Whitmore," he said. Not a question. She stopped. Her whole body went cold and still. "You're a hard one to follow," he said almost conversationally. "Took you off the road. Smart. Most don't think to do that." He tilted his head. "Your father sends his regards." She looked at him. She looked past him at the trail that went down into Millhaven 100 yards further than she could reach. She looked at the distance between them, 12 feet maybe. She measured it the way she'd been measuring distances all morning. The way a person measures distances when they're alone, and every inch counts. "What does he want?" she asked. Her voice came out steady. She was almost proud of it. "He wants you home." The man smiled. It didn't reach anything above his mouth. "Quiet, comfortable. No more letters to anyone. No more trouble." "And if I don't want to go home?" He spread his hands. Patient. Practiced. "Miss Whitmore, you're a 19-year-old girl standing alone on a ridge with a scraped-up knee and $11 in your purse." He paused. "There aren't many plays for you here." She held his gaze. Behind her ribs, her heart was doing something loud and fast and undignified. She kept her face still. "My father," she said slowly, "has been telling me my whole life what plays I have and don't have." "Has he been wrong?" "About me." She looked at him steadily. "Every single time." Something shifted in the man's expression. Not doubt, something closer to recalibration, like a scale that's been given a weight it didn't expect. He dropped his hands from his belt, and then from somewhere below and to the left a voice called out, "Dawson." The big man's head came up fast. Clara didn't move. The voice came again closer. "I said Dawson." The man Dawson turned his head just slightly to the left, And in that fraction of a second, Clara looked past him at the trail to Millhaven. Then she ran. She ran harder than she had ever run in her life. Her knee screamed at her, and she told it to be quiet, and she pushed down the trail stones sliding under her boots, her bag banging against her hip, the cold morning air hitting the back of her throat like a fist. She heard Dawson shout something behind her. She heard another voice, the one that had called out, but she couldn't make out words. She didn't stop to try. She hit the flat ground at the bottom of the ridge and kept going onto the main road of Millhaven, into the middle of the only street where a woman was sweeping the steps of a dry goods store, and a man was loading a wagon with feed sacks, and a boy of about 10 was sitting on a hitching rail eating an apple. They all looked at her. She stopped. She was breathing hard. Her knee was bleeding. She could feel it warm through her stocking. She turned around. Dawson was at the edge of town. Stopped. Just standing there at the edge of the road, watching her with the careful patience of a man who has decided that whatever the next move is, it isn't going to happen here in the open with witnesses. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come. She watched him go. She stood in the middle of Millhaven's single street, bleeding through her stocking, her chest, heaving the brass compass warm in her hand, and she watched him disappear back up toward the ridge. The woman with the broom had stopped sweeping. The man with the feed sacks had one hand resting still on a sack. The boy on the hitching rail had stopped eating his apple. "Ma'am," the woman said carefully. "You all right?" Clara turned to look at her. She was maybe 60, with a practical face and eyes that were asking a question they already suspected the answer to. "I need a room," Clara said. "And I need to know if there's a telegraph office in this town." The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she set her broom against the doorframe and pushed the door open behind her. "Both," she said. "Come inside." The boarding house was run by a woman named May Driscoll, who was 62 years old, had buried 2 husbands and 1 son, and had exactly no patience for men who used other people's fear as currency. She sat Clara down in her kitchen, looked at the scraped knee with no drama whatsoever, cleaned it with something that burned, wrapped it with clean cloth, and put a plate of food in front of her, while Clara was still trying to formulate a sentence. "Eat," May said. "Talk after." Clara ate. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her. She ate the way a person eats when their body has been making do on fear and motion for 6 hours straight, fast, and without tasting much of it. May sat across the table with her hands around a coffee cup and waited. "I left Red Hollow before sunrise," Clara said when the plate was half empty. "My father—" She stopped. The words felt strange outside her own head. She had been the daughter of Thomas Whitmore for 19 years. She had never said, "My father cast me out," to another person because it had never been true before this morning. "My father put me out. I walked north. A man stopped me on the ridge." "Big man. Brown duster," May said. Clara looked at her. "How was in town day before yesterday?" May said. "Asking about the county road north. Asking whether a young woman traveling alone would attract much attention in Millhaven." She picked up her coffee cup. "I told him everyone attracts attention in Millhaven. Doesn't mean everyone gets followed." "You knew he was looking for someone." "I knew he was being paid to look for someone," May said, which was a more precise and more uncomfortable distinction. That kind of man has a specific way of asking questions. Like the answer matters, but the person who gives it doesn't. Clara looked down at the table, at her scraped hands, at the coffee that May had set in front of her without being asked. "He'll come back," she said. "Or someone else will." "Probably." "I can't stay here." "Probably not." May set her cup down. "But you can stay tonight. Rest that knee. And you can send that telegraph you mentioned." She paused. "Who were you planning to wire?" Clara thought about it. The county land office. An attorney in Caldwell Flats, whose name she knew from the papers she'd seen on her father's desk. Someone official, someone with authority, someone who could what? Witness record protect. She didn't have a good answer to that yet. "I don't know," she admitted. May looked at her for a moment with those practical eyes. "There's a woman in Caldwell Flats named Harriet Voss. She runs the Temperance Society, which is a fine cover for about 15 other things she runs, including a way of getting women who need to be somewhere safe to somewhere safe. She held Clara's gaze. I have her address. I could wire ahead that you're coming. Clara felt something crack open in her chest. Not breaking, more like a window opening in a room that had been closed too long. The possibility of someone knowing she was coming. The possibility of not being entirely alone in this. Why would you do that for me? She asked. May looked almost amused. Because I was 19 once, she said simply. And because Thomas Whitmore evicted my cousin's family from their house in Dry Creek Hollow 3 days ago. She stood up and picked up Clara's plate. If you wrote a letter to the county land office on their behalf, then I reckon I owe you at least a telegraph wire and a night's sleep. Clara stared at her. May carried the plate to the wash basin. Room's upstairs, second door on the left. I'll send the wire at noon. You can pay me back when you have it. She couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow boarding house bed with her wrapped knee aching dully, and her mind refusing to slow down, and she listened to the sounds of Millhaven going about its morning, a wagon wheel on the road, voices in the street below. Somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith, and she thought about what she'd left behind and what was ahead of her, and whether those two men on horseback this morning had been scouting or tracking or simply watching to see which direction she'd run. She thought about Ethan Cole at the fence post. The compass was on the bedside table. She picked it up, turned it in her fingers. The needle swung and settled, always returning to north with a kind of quiet certainty she envied. I believe that he had said, when she'd told him she'd be fine. Not I hope so. Not you'll have to be. He had said I believe that, and he had looked at her like a man who was committing to a statement, not just filling silence with something reassuring. She didn't know Ethan Cole well enough to know why that mattered to her. She just knew that it did. That she had been standing at a fence post at 4:30 in the morning with the ruins of her life in a bag on her shoulder and the cold spreading up from the ground through her unlaced boots. And one person who didn't have to had come out in the dark to make sure she had a compass. She held the compass until she stopped shaking. Then she put it back on the bedside table and made herself close her eyes. Back at the Whitmore Ranch, at approximately the same hour that Clara was lying in May Driscoll's boarding house trying to sleep, a man arrived at the front gate on a hard-ridden horse. His name was Cal Reed, and he worked for Dawson's employer, which was to say, he worked for the company that Thomas Whitmore had contracted 3 weeks ago to handle certain matters of property security, and when the occasion arose, personal matters as well. Abel Price met him at the gate, because Abel always met people at the gate. It was one of the quiet dignities he maintained in a job that required him to look away from a great many indignities. Dawson's in Millhaven, Reed said, not bothering with pleasantries. She made it there. There were witnesses, so he held back, waiting for direction. Abel said nothing. Mr. Whitmore needs to know what he wants done. Reed looked at him with flat professional eyes. She stays in Millhaven. She starts talking to people. Already talked to that Driscoll woman, sounds like. That gets complicated. What are the options? Abel asked. He kept his voice the same way he always kept his voice, steady, practical, giving nothing. Bring her back willing. Bring her back not willing. Or... Reed stopped. Or what? Abel said flatly. Reed tilted his head slightly. Or she doesn't need to come back. She just needs to stop. Abel looked at him for a long time. The morning was getting on. The sun was well up now, burning off the frost, and the ranch was alive with the sounds of a normal working day. Cattle, hands, horses, the ordinary machinery of a prosperous operation. You'll wait here, Abel said. He walked up to the house. Thomas Whitmore was in his study when Abel knocked. He looked up from whatever paper he was reading and took in Abel's expression with the efficiency of a man who has employed the same person for 20 years and knows what every variation of their face means. She's in Millhaven, Abel said. Thomas said nothing. Reed's outside. He's asking for direction. Thomas set the paper down. He turned slightly in his chair, looking at the window that faced north. The window that looked in the direction of the county road. The direction Clara had gone. What are the options? Thomas asked. Abel told him. The silence afterward was long. Abel stood in it and kept his face still and thought about a 19-year-old girl with scraped-up hands walking north in her mother's old coat, and he made himself keep breathing evenly. "She's my daughter," Thomas said finally. To the window. "Yes, sir." "She made her choice." "Yes, sir." Another long pause. "Tell Reed to bring her back." His voice was flat. "Willing if possible. I don't—" He stopped. Something moved across his face, brief and complicated. "I don't want harm to come to her. I want her home." "And if she won't come?" Thomas turned back from the window and picked up his paper again. "Then he makes sure she understands that the world outside this ranch is not as accommodating as she thinks it is." He opened the paper. "That's all, Abel." Abel walked back outside. He stood in the yard for a moment before going to find Reed. He stood in the late morning sun of a day that was going to be fine and clear and perfectly ordinary, and he thought about the compass he'd seen Ethan Cole carry in his coat pocket for 3 years without ever using it on this flat, well-mapped land. He thought about the fact that Ethan Cole had not shown up for morning work call. Abel went to find Reed. He didn't mention Ethan Cole. Ethan had been riding since shortly after 5 in the morning. He'd watched Clara go through the gate and down the north road, and he'd stood at the fence post long enough to make sure she wasn't going to turn back, and then he'd gone to the stable. Not his horse. His own horse was a bay mare named Pepper, who was fine for cattle work, but not built for distance at speed. He took the gray gelding that belonged to nobody in particular, a ranch horse that got borrowed and returned without much ceremony, and he saddled it quietly in the dark while the bunkhouse was still breathing slow. I hadn't left a note. There was nothing to say in a note that would make the situation simpler, and Ethan Cole had a deep instinctive preference for not making things complicated. He had left. He had pointed the gray north. He had ridden. I was not precisely sure what he intended to do when he caught up to her. He had thought about it during the first 2 hours on the road and hadn't arrived at a clean answer. He could not make her accept help. He could not make her trust him. She barely knew him, which was the fair and reasonable truth of it. He was a ranch hand who'd given her a compass at a fence post and told her to move fast through the tree cover. That was the entire history of their acquaintance. But he had heard Thomas Whitmore talking in the study the night before. He had not been deliberately eavesdropping. He had come to the main house to deliver a message from the foreman about the fence line in the lower pasture, and the study window had been open and voices carry. He had heard enough to know what Thomas Whitmore's idea of handling a wayward daughter looked like in practical terms. He had heard Reed's name, which he recognized. He knew Cal Reed's name, the way that men who have worked rough country know certain other men's names, not from friendship, but from reputation. The kind of reputation that came with specific, unpleasant stories attached. So he was riding north. He'd lost her trail at the edge of the Briggs property. She'd gone off-road, which was smarter than he'd expected, though he recognized he had no real basis for expecting anything one way or another about Clara Whitmore. He'd followed the logic of it instead of the tracks. If she was avoiding the road and heading north, she'd eventually have to come back to the road or find high ground. The ridge above Millhaven was the natural choice. He'd come up on the ridge from the east, and he'd seen Dawson at about the same time he'd heard voices below him. He'd called out. He hadn't meant to. Or rather, he hadn't planned it. He'd simply looked at the situation in front of him, a big man with a professional bearing and a very specific way of standing that Ethan recognized, and a girl in a gray coat at the other end of a 12-foot gap, and he'd made the same calculation he made when he saw a calf in trouble in a creek crossing. You move first, then figure out the rest. He'd called Dawson's name. He knew Dawson by sight, had seen him in town twice, and in the fraction of a second, when Dawson looked away, Clara ran. Ethan had let her go. He'd stayed on the ridge with Dawson, and they'd looked at each other with the wordless understanding of two men who both know exactly what a situation is. And Dawson had said nothing, and Ethan had said nothing, and eventually Dawson had turned and walked away. That had been 2 hours ago. Now Ethan sat in his saddle at the edge of Millhaven and looked at the street below and thought about what exactly he planned to say. He found her in May Driscoll's kitchen. May had fed him too. She seemed to be the kind of woman who fed people reflexively, the way other people offered water. And she'd looked at him with shrewd eyes and said, "You Whitmore's man?" "Used to be," Ethan said. May had considered that answer for a moment and then called upstairs. Clara came down slowly, one hand on the railing, favoring her left knee. When she saw him, she stopped halfway down the stairs and held the railing with both hands and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You followed me," she said. "I rode ahead mostly." "Why?" He held her gaze. "Dawson's not alone. Reed is coming. Maybe already on the road." She came the rest of the way down the stairs. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at him. This ranch hand she barely knew, standing in a stranger's kitchen with his hat in his hand and a question on the table between them that neither of them had asked out loud yet. "What do you want?" she asked. Her voice was direct, not unkind, but not soft either. She'd had a hard morning, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "I want to know which direction you're going," he said, "and I want to ride it with you if you'll let me." He paused. "You don't have to let me. That's the whole of what I'm saying. You don't owe me a yes. But Reed and Dawson together are more than you should have to manage alone. And He stopped, started again more carefully. "I'm not interested in going back to the Whitmore ranch." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. "May is wiring a woman in Caldwell Flats," Clara said. "A woman who can help. I was going to go east." "Caldwell Flats is 2 days east," Ethan said. "Good roads most of the way, some open country in the middle section." "You know the road." "I know enough of it." She looked down at the compass in her hand. He recognized it, of course he did. She looked at it for a moment, then back up at him. "I don't need protecting," she said. "I know. I'm not going home, no matter what. I know that too." "And you're done with Whitmore's ranch?" "Done this morning," he said, "when I saddled the gray." She looked at him. He had the feeling again of being seen clearly, of her taking a real accounting of him. Not just the outline of him, but the actual content. He stood still for it. He figured he owed her that much. "All right," she said finally. "All right. You can ride with me." She turned toward the hallway. "We leave when May has a reply from Caldwell Flats. An hour, maybe less." He put his hat back on. "I'll see to the horses." She was already halfway down the hall. She called back without turning around. "Ethan." He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for the ridge." He didn't say "you're welcome" because it seemed like the wrong kind of response to the wrong kind of moment. He said, "You ran fast." He heard something that might have been a short, surprised laugh before she disappeared around the corner. May Driscoll at the stove did not look up from whatever she was doing, but the corner of her mouth moved slightly in a direction that suggested she had heard everything and was keeping her opinion to herself for now. Ethan went to see to the horses. Outside, the morning was giving way to afternoon, and somewhere south on the county road, 2 men were riding north with specific instructions from Thomas Whitmore about a daughter who had gotten too far from home. And in a boarding house kitchen in Mill Haven, a telegraph wire was being composed that would reach Caldwell Flats before dark. And in the stable, behind the boarding house, a man who had ridden away from one life before sunrise was tightening a saddle cinch and deciding without quite deciding it that the next life was going to look very different from the last one. And upstairs, a woman in her mother's coat sat on the edge of a narrow bed with a brass compass in her hand, pointing north, and made herself breathe, and made herself think, and made herself ready. The telegraph reply came in 53 minutes. May set the paper on the kitchen table in front of Clara without ceremony, the way she did everything directly, without dressing it up. Clara read it twice. The handwriting was the telegraph operator's, but the words were someone else's, entirely compact and precise, in the way of a person who has learned to say exactly what needs to be said and nothing more. "Room ready. Come east. Don't stop in Grazer's Crossing. HV." Clara folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. "She knew we were coming before May wired her," she said. May was already moving toward the back door. "Harriet Voss knows most things before most people think to tell her. That's how she stayed useful for 30 years. She pushed the door open and called into the yard. Cole, she's ready. Ethan came around from the stable leading both horses. He'd watered them and checked the gray's left shoe, which had been sitting loose, and found a nail in May's tool shed to reset it. He looked at Clara's face when she came out, read it the same way he'd been reading trail sign all morning, looking for what mattered, and said, "Good news or complicated news?" "Both," Clara said. She took the reins of the horse May had arranged for her, a sturdy brown mare named Bess, borrowed from the livery, with May's word as collateral, and put her foot in the stirrup. Her knee protested sharply. She got up anyway. "We don't stop in Grazer's Crossing. That's 40 miles east. We won't make it today regardless. Then we camp short of it." She looked at May, who was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching them with the expression of a woman who has sent people down difficult roads before and knows better than to make it ceremonial. "Thank you," Clara said, "for everything." "Wire me when you reach Harriet's," May said. "So I know you got there." She paused. "And if Reed comes through here asking questions, I'll tell him you went north into the mountains. Ought to buy you half a day." Ethan looked at her. "That's not a small thing to do." May looked back at him with those flat, practical eyes. "No," she said. "It isn't." She went back inside and closed the door. They rode east out of Millhaven at a walk single file on the narrow road, not speaking. The town fell behind them in 20 minutes. The country opened up wide and dry and quiet, in the way that afternoon quiet in open land has its own particular weight, like the land itself is listening. After a while, Ethan moved up beside her. "Reed is faster than Dawson," he said, "and smarter." "How do you know Reed?" How was quiet for a moment, in the way she was starting to recognize, not evasion, just the habit of a man who checks the weight of words before he uses them. 3 years ago, I was working cattle near the Colorado border. There was a dispute over grazing rights. A man named Hendricks hired Reed to resolve it. He paused. Reed resolved it in a way that left one of Hendricks's neighbors unable to work his land anymore. Clara looked at him. "Unable how?" "The neighbor had an accident," Ethan said. "The kind of accident that happens when someone arranges for it to happen." The silence that followed was the kind that carries information. "My father hired that man," Clara said. 3 weeks ago, according to what I heard through the study window." She rode without speaking for a long moment. The road was hard-packed dirt, still warm from the afternoon sun. The kind of road that carried sound, well hoofbeats, wind the distant cry of a hawk somewhere above them. She listened to all of it automatically, the way a person listens when they've been running long enough that listening becomes instinct. "He hired Reed before I wrote the letter," she said. "Yes." "So it wasn't just about the letter?" "No," Ethan said. "I don't think it was." She let that settle. The letter had been the stated reason the insult cited at the dinner table, the evidence laid out. But Thomas Whitmore had hired a man like Cal Reed 3 weeks before that dinner. 3 weeks before Clara had sent the letter to the county land office, which meant he had been making preparations for something, and the letter had simply given him the occasion. She thought about her father at the head of the table. The quiet voice, the flat hands, the careful practiced performance of a man explaining a consequence rather than making a choice. "You made your decision. I'm simply responding to it." He'd been planning this, whatever this was. "Ethan." "Yeah." What did he actually say through the study window, exactly? He glanced at her. Then he told her not the softened version, not the version where he left out the parts that were hardest to hear. He told her what Thomas Whitmore had said about handling her, about resolving the situation with Clara, the way a man resolves a problem with a fence line or a water right. The language of property applied to a person. Clara listened without interrupting. Her face stayed still. Only her hands on the reins told the truth, tight, then tighter, then deliberately loosened again, the way you'd loosen a fist you didn't mean to make. "He said it like that," she said when Ethan finished. "Like I was a fence line." "He said it like a man who has never had to think very hard about the difference," Ethan said carefully. She rode. The hawk cried again, further away now. "I've known him my whole life," she said. And I don't think I knew him at all. Ethan didn't offer a consolation for that. He just rode beside her, which was its own kind of answer, the presence of someone who understood that some realizations don't need commentary. They just need to be survived. They rode for another mile before either of them spoke again. Then Ethan said, "There's a ranch about 8 miles east. Folks named Garber. I've done work for them before. They won't turn us away for the night, and they won't talk about having seen us." Clara nodded. 8 miles. An hour, maybe a little more at this pace. She could manage an hour. She checked the compass in her pocket. East. Still east. The needle didn't waver. She put it back and kept riding. They were 4 miles out of Millhaven when the first shot cracked the air. It came from behind and high, a ridge shot the kind meant to announce, rather than hit, though the distance between announcement and intention was a very short road. Clara's horse shied hard left. She stayed in the saddle through pure reflexive grip and got Bess under control in 3 strides, already turning to look back. The ridge behind them was 300 yards south. She couldn't see anyone on it, just the sound hanging in the air and the echo coming back from the opposite hillside a second later, like confirmation. "Move," Ethan said, and his voice had changed, still low, but clipped now, everything unnecessary stripped out of it. He was already pushing the gray into a canter. "Stay with me and don't stop." She didn't ask questions. She rode. They went off the road immediately. Ethan angling north across open ground, and she followed him with Bess's hooves throwing up clods of dry earth behind them. Her knee was a sustained bright agony in the stirrup, and she overrode it the same way she'd been overriding everything since 4:30 this morning, by deciding that it was less important than what was in front of her. Another shot. This one closer, which meant they'd been ranging the first one. Ranging meant someone was trying to hit something. She bent low over Bess's neck and rode. Ethan pulled up behind a long rise of ground, not cover exactly, but concealment, the kind of low ridge that breaks a sightline without stopping anything, and she came in beside him, and they both pulled to a stop and listened. Nothing. No hoofbeats following. No third shot. "One rifle," Ethan said. He was looking back over the rise, still and watchful. "One that we heard." He glanced at her sideways. "Right. Reed. Reed doesn't do his own shooting." He kept watching. "Someone he hired. Or Dawson has a rifle and decided the witness problem is less concerning than I thought. Or my father sent a third man we don't know about. Also possible." He waited another 30 seconds. Nothing. "They're not following on horseback or we'd hear it. They were positioned, they knew the road east. May said she'd tell them I went north. May sent her wire before Reed got to Millhaven." His jaw tightened slightly. If he got there fast enough and asked the telegraph operator instead of May, he'd know which direction. Clara thought about that. The wire to Harriet Voss. The direction east. If Reed had reached the telegraph office in Millhaven before May had the chance to redirect him. "We have to change direction," she said. "If we go south, we hit Whitmore Land. If we go north, we hit the mountain passes and it's September. If we keep east, they know where we're going." He looked at her. "Which means we go east, but not on the road." She looked out at this country around them, open, dry, mapped in her head from years of riding her father's land. She knew this territory. Not perfectly, not the way she knew the Whitmore Range, but enough. "There's a creek bed that runs northeast from here. Dry this time of year. If we follow it east, it comes out about 3 miles north of the main road, near a place called Miller's Ford. I know Miller's Ford. From Miller's Ford, we can cut south and pick up the road again on the far side of the ridge they're using." She paused. "It adds 2 hours. It also means they can't predict our line." "Yes." He nodded once. "Lead." She went first. She picked up the dry creek bed by memory and by the slightly lower line of the land, and the way the dry grass grew differently at the edges of what had once been a waterway. She followed it east, northeast at a trot, Bess moving easily on the flat creek bottom, and Ethan's gray came behind her with the quiet reliability of a horse that has learned to trust its rider. They didn't speak for the next 40 minutes. The land did the talking, the sound of hooves on dry earth, the occasional complaint of a ground bird flushed from the grass ahead. the wind that had picked up from the west and pushed against their right sides with a coolness that meant the temperature was going to drop fast once the sun went down. Clara was thinking about Grazer's Crossing. Don't stop in Grazer's Crossing. That was what Harriet Voss had put in the wire. Not be careful in Grazer's Crossing, not watch yourself. Don't stop. The kind of instruction you give when the danger isn't cautionary, but categorical. She was also thinking about what Ethan had said. Reed doesn't do his own shooting, which meant there was someone else out here they hadn't accounted for. Someone posted on a ridge with a rifle who knew the East Road, which meant someone who had been positioned in advance, which meant this had been arranged before she left the house this morning. Not improvised. Arranged. She pulled Bess up and turned around. Ethan came up beside her immediately, reading the change in her pace. "My father planned this," she said. "Before this morning." "I think so." "The evictions in Dry Creek Hollow. The letter I wrote. He couldn't have known I'd write that letter 3 weeks ago." "No." "So what was he planning for?" Ethan was quiet. He looked at her steadily. "What were you doing 3 weeks ago?" he asked. She thought back. 3 weeks ago. The end of August. She had been going through the household accounts. She always kept the household accounts. It was one of the few domestic duties Thomas had assigned her that she was actually good at, and that he acknowledged she was good at. She'd been going through the accounts, and she'd found a discrepancy. A payment. A large one made to a land attorney in Caldwell Flats for services related to a property consolidation that was not in any record she'd seen before. She had asked her father about it. Casually, she'd thought. At the breakfast table. He had told her it was nothing she needed to concern herself with. She told Ethan this. He listened with his full attention, the way he listened to everything, and when she finished he said, "What property was the consolidation for?" "I don't know. The record just listed a parcel number, but the attorney's name was Harlan Cross." She paused. "Harlan Cross also handles title disputes for the county." Ethan went very still. "What?" Clara said. "Harlan Cross died 2 weeks ago," he said. "I heard it from one of the hands who rode into town for supplies. Fell from his horse, they said. Broke his neck." She stared at him. "Fell from a horse he'd ridden for 12 years, Ethan said carefully. According to the same hand, Cross was known for being one of the finest riders in the county. The creek bed was quiet around them. The wind moved through the dry grass at the edges. Clara held very still on Bess's back and felt the world rearranging itself around her into a shape she didn't quite want to see. "He's not trying to bring me home," she said. Ethan's face was careful and direct. "I don't think that's the primary objective. He's trying to shut me up. Whatever I saw in those accounts, whatever that property consolidation was for, he can't have me talking about it." She felt cold in a way that the September wind had nothing to do with. The letter to the land office was an excuse. A reason to cast me out that everyone in Red Hollow would believe and accept because Thomas Whitmore's daughter dishonoring the family, that's a story people know. That makes sense to them. She paused. "But the real problem is that I saw the accounts, and you might have seen enough to understand what he's doing." "Do I understand it?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "Do you?" She thought about the parcel number. She hadn't memorized it. She'd looked at it for maybe 10 seconds, and then her father's voice had been in the hallway, and she'd closed the ledger and smoothed her face and gone to the table like nothing had happened. But she remembered enough. She remembered the first 3 digits of the parcel number. And she knew that in Clearwater County, parcel numbers that started with those 3 digits corresponded to land in a specific region, land north and east of the Whitmore Range. Land that was currently, to her knowledge, in a contested title situation between 3 old ranch families and the county itself. Land worth, if she had to guess, based on what she knew of that region, somewhere between $200,000 and $500,000. "He's buying something he's not supposed to be able to buy," she said slowly. "Something that's in dispute. Something that requires a title attorney to make the sale look clean." She looked at Ethan. And Harlan Cross either got cold feet or asked for more money or saw something he shouldn't have. "And had an accident," Ethan said. "And had an accident," she repeated. They sat with that on the wind for a moment. "Clara." His voice was quiet. If that's what this is, if he's not just protecting property, but protecting something that already has a body attached to it, then this is beyond Reed and Dawson and bounty hunters on a ridge. I know. Harriet Voss needs to know all of this. I know that too, and we need to get to her faster than we planned. He glanced at the sky. The sun had moved further than either of them had tracked the afternoon, sliding toward evening, with the particular indifference of days that don't care what you're going through. Miller's Ford, then south, then east on the road, fast as we can push them without laming anyone. She checked the compass. East. Let's go, she said. They went. Miller's Ford came up in 40 minutes. A shallow crossing she remembered from a childhood trip, the stones at the bottom worn smooth, the banks on either side still holding the ghost of the water that had run here in wetter years. They crossed without stopping the horses, picking their way carefully, and came out on the south side and immediately pushed into a canter toward the main road. The road came up in another 20 minutes. Empty. No riders. No dust on the horizon in either direction. They turned east and rode hard. The miles passed in a rhythm that was close to mindless, the hoofbeats the wind, the road unreeling ahead of them in the declining light. Clara's knee had gone from sharp pain to a deep grinding ache that she'd simply incorporated into the experience of existing. The way you incorporate a toothache on a day when you have bigger problems. She rode straight and kept her eyes on the road. After an hour, Ethan said, "Garber's is another 2 miles. We should still stop there." "You said they won't talk." "They won't. And the horses need water and rest, and so do you." He glanced at her knee. She hadn't mentioned it, but he'd been watching the way she sat the saddle. "You've been favoring that leg for 4 hours." "I'm fine. I believe you," he said. And she heard the same weight in it that she'd heard at the fence post that morning. Not dismissal, not false reassurance. Just the simple level statement of a man who meant what he said. But fine doesn't mean you should keep pushing it past what's necessary. We stop at Garber's Rest, 2 hours ride at first light. She thought about Reed, about how fast a man moved when he was paid to move fast. 2 hours, she said. Then we ride. 2 hours, he agreed. The Garber Ranch was a modest operation. One main house, a barn, a bunkhouse, a well in the yard that had been maintained for 30 years by people who understood that in this country, water was the difference between living and not. A woman came to the door when they rode in Clara's age or younger with a baby on her hip, and the expression of someone who has learned to read visitors quickly and accurately. "Ethan Cole," the woman said. Not quite a question. "Mrs. Garber," Ethan said, touching his hat. "I'm sorry to come unannounced. We need water and 2 hours rest. We won't trouble you past that." Mrs. Garber looked at Clara, at the wrapped knee, at the coat that had seen better days, at the brass compass visible in Clara's coat pocket. She looked at all of this the way May Driscoll had looked at her, with the quick, practical assessment of a woman who makes decisions based on what she sees and doesn't waste time pretending she doesn't see it. "Come in," she said. Inside the Garber house was warm and plainly furnished and smelled like bread that had been baked recently and coffee that was still on the stove. Clara sat at the kitchen table, and Mrs. Garber, her name was Anna, gave her coffee and looked at the knee with competent hands and said the wrapping was fine, but should be changed in the morning. She said this without asking how it had happened, which Clara appreciated more than she could have easily explained. Mr. Garber came in from the barn while Ethan was still seeing to the horses. He was a lean, quiet man of maybe 45, with a sunburned neck and steady hands, and he looked at his wife's face when he came in, read whatever he read there, and sat down at the table across from Clara with the settled manner of a man deciding something without making a speech about it. "You're Whitmore's girl," he said. Clara looked at him directly. "I was," she said. "I'm not sure that's the accurate description anymore." He considered this. "He put you out. Before sunrise." He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already half known. "Whitmore's been buying land east of his range," he said. "I know because my neighbor sold a piece of his property last month and told me the buyer's name was on the papers as a holding company he'd never heard of. My neighbor is not a sophisticated man. I knew what that meant when he told me." He looked at his coffee cup. 3 weeks later, my neighbor found his fences cut and his cattle scattered, and a note on his door suggesting his property would be safer under different management. Clara felt it click into place. The same property consolidation, the same pattern. Not just the disputed land, the land around the disputed land too, the approach, the preparation. Thomas Whitmore had been building something for months, maybe longer, and the Harlan Cross payment was just one piece of it. "Did your neighbor report it?" she asked. "To who?" Garber said simply. The answer to that was the answer to a lot of things in Clearwater County, where Thomas Whitmore had been the dominant landowner for 2 decades, and the sheriff played poker with him on Thursday nights. Ethan came in from the barn, and Anna poured him coffee without being asked, and he sat down and looked at Garber. And Garber looked back at him, and something passed between them that didn't need words. The recognition of 2 men who have both worked the same kind of land and know what it costs and what it means. "Reed is behind us," Ethan said. "How far?" "Few hours, maybe less." Garber nodded. "You're not going to use the main road east of here," he said. It wasn't a question. "We're trying not to." Garber was quiet for a moment. Then he got up and went to a shelf near the door and came back with a folded paper worn at the creases. He spread it on the table. A map, hand-drawn, not the county surveyor's version, but the kind of map a man makes for himself over years of working and writing his own region, full of notations that only make sense if you know the land. "There's a trail south of the main road," he said, pointing. "Runs parallel about a mile down. It's rough, but it's passable. It comes out 4 miles west of Grazer's Crossing." "We're not going into Grazer's Crossing," Clara said. "You don't want to," he agreed. "There's a man named Tillis who runs the Grazer's Crossing livery. He's on Whitmore's payroll, has been for 2 years. Anyone who comes through asking about travelers east. Tillis is the first person they stop." He looked at her. "You go 4 miles west of Grazer's Crossing on my trail, and then cut north back to the main road east of town. You bypass Tillis entirely." Clara looked at the map. At the trail he was indicating. At the way the land folded between the main road and the southern route, the creek beds, the rise and fall of it, the places where a person on a horse could move fast and invisible. "Can we make this in the dark?" she asked Ethan. He studied the map. "With a good moon and horses that aren't blown, yeah." "The moon's good tonight," Garber said. "Clear sky all week." Clara looked at Anna, who was standing at the stove with the baby still on her hip, listening to all of this with the quiet attention of a woman who has chosen to be in the room. "You don't have to do this," Clara said. "Either of you. If Reed comes through and finds out you helped us." "Reed came through here 6 weeks ago," Anna said from the stove. Her voice was calm and matter-of-fact. "He asked Jacob some questions about the property east of ours. Jacob told him what he needed to hear to go away." She shifted the baby to her other hip. "We've been watching what's coming for a while now. Helping you isn't a risk we're taking, it's a choice we're making." The room was quiet for a moment. Ethan looked at Clara. Clara looked at the map. At the hand-drawn lines that represented years of someone else's work and knowledge being offered freely in a kitchen that smelled like bread on a day that had started with a bolt slamming home in a dark door. "Thank you," she said. The words weren't adequate, and she knew it and said them anyway. "Rest," Anna said. "Hour and a half, then you ride." They rested. Clara sat in the chair at the Garber kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and let herself be still for the first time since 4:30 that morning. She didn't sleep. She wasn't sure she could sleep the way her mind was running, but she stopped moving, which was its own kind of relief. The baby fell asleep on Anna's lap. Garber went back out to the barn. Ethan sat across from her with his hat on the table and drank his coffee and didn't try to fill the silence. After a while, Clara said, "When you were at the fence post this morning, you'd already decided." He looked up. "You didn't just come out to give me a compass," she said. "You'd already decided you were going to follow." I thought about it. He didn't deny it, which she appreciated. "I heard enough through the study window," he said. "I couldn't unhear it." He turned his coffee cup in both hands. "I knew I wasn't going to stay on that ranch, and I knew I wasn't going to ride south, so north seemed—" He paused. "North seemed like the right direction." "You could have said that at the fence post. You would have told me not to come." She looked at him. "Yes, she said. I would have. I know. So you waited until Millhaven. Gave you time to see how the morning went, he said mildly. She felt something shift in her chest. Not quite amusement. Not quite something else. Something without a clean name that lived in the space between gratitude and the unsettling recognition of being understood by someone you don't entirely know yet. That's a very calculated way of helping someone, she said. I prefer to think of it as patient. There's a difference. One of them sounds better. She looked at him for a moment. He was looking back at her with that steady directness, the kind that didn't push and didn't pull away, just held its ground. She thought about what it meant, what it actually meant for a man to ride away from a paying job at 5 in the morning and follow a near stranger across broken country towards something that was getting more complicated by the hour, with an armed man behind them and a dead attorney in the history and a corrupt land deal unraveling in all directions. She thought about what that kind of decision cost. Ethan, she said. Yeah. When we get to Harriet Voss, if we get there, what happens to you? He seemed genuinely to not have thought about this in the way she was asking. He considered it now the same way he considered everything, with that quiet, unhurried attention. I figure that depends on what Harriet Voss can do with what you know, he said finally. And on whether the law in Caldwell Flats is actually separate from your father, or just a different branch of the same tree. And if it's the same tree, then we find a different tree, he said simply. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked down at the compass in her hand. She hadn't realized she'd taken it out. It had become such an automatic thing. The needle pointed east. Okay, she said. Anna came in from the hallway. Time, she said. They rode out of the Garber Ranch in the clean, cold dark of full night, with a 3/4 moon throwing silver across the ground, and the southern trail unfolding ahead of them in the map. Garber had folded and pressed into Ethan's hand. The horses were rested and moved well. The night was quiet. Clara rode and thought about parcel numbers and land attorneys and a man who fell from a horse he'd ridden for 12 years. She thought about what she'd seen in the accounts. She thought about the 3 digits of the parcel number she remembered. She turned them over in her mind, the way you turn over a key, looking for the lock it fits. She'd seen the county land records before her father had used them often enough, spreading the surveyor's maps on his desk and tracing the borders of parcels he intended to acquire. She knew the naming system. She knew the regions. Those 3 digits corresponded to a parcel in the northeast quarter of Clearwater County. In the northeast quarter of Clearwater County, there was one piece of land that mattered above all others, right now. One piece of land that was in contested title, that had been in contested title for 3 years, that the county had been unable to resolve because 3 different claimants all had paperwork that looked legitimate, and a judge who kept finding reasons to postpone the ruling. That land sat on top of the only reliable water source in the northeast quarter. Whoever controlled that water controlled every ranch within 15 miles of it, which was 8 ranches, possibly 10 depending on the season. She pulled Bess up sharply. Ethan was beside her in an instant. What? I know what he's buying, she said. He waited. The Clearwater Spring parcel, she said. It controls the water for the whole northeast quarter. 8 ranches, maybe more. If he owns the spring, he owns the water rights. If he owns the water rights, he can charge whatever he wants for access, Ethan said slowly. Or shut off anyone who doesn't cooperate. Or force them to sell their land for whatever he offers. She looked at him in the moonlight. It's not just one eviction in Dry Creek Hollow. That's the opening move. He's been planning to control the entire northeast quarter. The quiet of the night was very complete around them. Harriet Voss needs to know this tonight, Ethan said. We're still half a day out. Then we ride faster. He looked at the sky, at the moon, at the trail ahead. Can you ride through the night? Her knee answered before she did a hot, insistent throb that climbed from the joint all the way to her hip. She overrode it with the same logic she'd been applying all day. Yes, she said. Then let's go. She kicked Bess into a canter. Behind them somewhere on the dark road. West, a man named Reed was riding east. He had gotten the telegraph information in Millhaven, not from May Driscoll. May had been too careful, but from the telegraph operator's assistant, a young man of 19 who had been offered 2 months' wages for 5 minutes of conversation. Reed knew the direction. He knew the destination. He had 2 men with him now, not one. One of them was the man who'd fired from the ridge. They were riding hard, and ahead of them, on a southern trail that Garber had drawn from memory, 2 horses moved through the moonlight at a canter, carrying between them a girl who had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and a man who had decided that mattered, both of them riding east towards someone who might be able to do something about it. The night held all of them, the pursuers, and the pursued, the road and the trail, the dark and the moon, and it kept its own counsel about how it was going to end. But Clara Whitmore, riding with the brass compass, warm in her pocket, and the cold wind against her face, and the first real clarity she'd had all day, burning behind her eyes, was not riding like someone who intended to be caught. She was riding like someone who had finally understood what they were fighting for. And that, in her experience, in the experience of everyone who had ever watched her, and underestimated what they were seeing, made her considerably more dangerous than before. They rode through the dark for 4 hours without stopping. Clara didn't count the miles. She counted her breaths instead, the way her riding instructor had taught her when she was 8 years old, and learning to jump back when Thomas Whitmore had still been the kind of father who hired riding instructors. "Count your breaths," the old man had said. "When everything else gets loud, count your breaths." She'd never forgotten it. She used it now the way she'd used the compass all day, as a fixed point in a moving world. 1 breath. 2. Bess's hooves on the southern trail, steady and sure. Ethan's gray, 2 lengths ahead, a dark shape against the moonlit ground. The cold coming up from the earth the way it did in September nights, not the cold of winter, but the cold of warning, a reminder of what was coming and how little margin there was. She was thinking about the Clearwater Spring parcel when Ethan pulled up without warning and threw out his left hand, the flat palm stop signal she'd learned from ranch hands before she could ride properly. She stopped. She listened. Hoofbeats. South of them. Moving east parallel to the trail. Not 1 horse. At least 2. Moving at a pace that wasn't casual. She and Ethan looked at each other in the dark. He pointed north off the trail into the open ground. She nodded, and they moved, walking the horses slow and quiet, until the trail sounds dropped away behind them, until there was only the wind and the distant hoofbeats that continued east and then faded. They held still for a full 2 minutes. "He split them," Ethan said quietly. "Reed kept 1 man on the main road and sent another south in case we cut off. He knows about Garber's trail. He knows someone in this county drew us a map." His jaw was tight. "Tillis. Garber said Tillis is Whitmore's man in Grazer's Crossing. If Reed stopped there before us, Tillis would know the southern route." Clara's hands tightened on the reins. "He'd have told Reed where to position. So we can't use the trail anymore." "No. And we can't use the main road." "No." They sat in the dark in the middle of open country with a 3/4 moon that was beautiful and merciless in equal measure. And Clara did the geometry of it. What was behind them, what was ahead, what was north, what was south, what was possible, and what wasn't. She had been doing this kind of geometry all day. She was getting better at it. "How far are we from Caldwell Flats?" she asked. 12 miles, maybe 13. "Straight east." "Straight east is the main road. We just said—" "I know what we just said." She was thinking fast. "There's a railroad spur that runs east from Miller's Junction. I remember it from the county maps my father kept. It goes to Caldwell Flats, straight line, no detouring, no Grazer's Crossing." She looked at him. "Miller's Junction is 3 miles north of here." He was quiet for a moment. "The railroad spur is a freight line, no passenger service." "I know. If there's a train running tonight, there's a Thursday freight that leaves Miller's Junction at 2 in the morning," she said. "It reaches Caldwell Flats by 5. I know because my father used it twice a year to ship cattle east, and I kept the scheduling records." She met his eyes. "Today is Thursday." A beat of silence. "What time is it now?" he asked. She looked at the moon. "Close to midnight." 3 miles north, then we leave the horses. We leave the horses, she confirmed. The cost of that sat for a moment. Bess borrowed on May's word the gray taken without much ceremony from a stable that now belonged to a world behind them. She'd find a way to make it right. Later. Can we make 3 miles in an hour? On open ground with a good moon. Yes. He was already turning the gray north. Move. She moved. They covered the 3 miles in 50 minutes, cutting north across open grassland that was harder on the horses than the trail, but unpredictable. In the way they needed unpredictable, no established route, no logic that Reed's men could anticipate. Clara's knee had stopped hurting in the specific way of an injury, and started hurting in the general way of something that had been pushed well past its limit, and was simply registering the fact without much hope of being listened to. Miller's Junction was a small operation, a water tower, a freight shed, 2 sets of tracks, and a nightman who sat inside the shed with a lantern and a week-old newspaper. When they came in from the north side, he startled badly, and then looked at them with the expression of a man assessing whether this was ordinary trouble or the other kind. Freight east, Ethan said. 2 passengers. The nightman looked at them for a long moment. At Clara's coat. At Ethan's steady posture. At the horses they'd ground-tied outside. Freight don't take passengers. I know, Ethan said. He reached into his coat pocket. I'm asking anyway. What came out of his pocket was not what Clara expected. Not money, though money followed, but first a small folded paper. He handed it to the nightman, who unfolded it and read it and looked up at Ethan with an expression that had shifted into something Clara couldn't quite read. You know Bill Cutter, the nightman said. He's my uncle, Ethan said. He told me if I ever came through Miller's Junction in trouble to show that paper to whoever was working nights. The nightman looked at the paper again, then at Clara, then at Ethan. He folded the paper and handed it back and stood up from his chair. Freight leaves at 2, he said. You'll ride in the second car with the dry goods. Don't touch anything that isn't yours. Don't make noise when we pass through Grazer's Crossing. He paused. And if anyone asks, you weren't here, and I didn't see you. Understood, Ethan said. The nightman went back to his newspaper. Clara grabbed Ethan's arm the moment they were outside. You have an uncle who works the railroad. Had. Bill Cutter retired 2 years ago. He glanced at her. But he trained every nightman on this line for 15 years. That paper is a letter of introduction he wrote when I first started working this part of the country. I've never used it before. You carry it anyway. Bill said carry it anyway. A brief pause. Bill was right about most things. She stared at him. How many contingencies do you have that I don't know about? He almost smiled. It was small and quick and gone before it fully arrived. We should see to the horses before the train leaves. They left the horses with the nightman, a borrowed arrangement that Ethan negotiated in 3 sentences, promising that a man named Garber would come for them within 2 days, a promise that the nightman accepted with the resigned flexibility of someone who handles the irregular complications of the frontier on a regular basis. The freight car was cold and dark and smelled like sawdust and dried beans and the ghost of 1,000 previous cargo loads. Clara sat on a crate with her back against the wall and her knee stretched out in front of her, and she listened to the train finding its rhythm, the initial lurch and groan of it, the slow acceleration, the settling into the long eastward pull, and she felt something unclench in her chest that had been clenched since the moment she'd heard the first rifle shot that afternoon. Not safe. She wasn't safe. But moving and moving in a direction Reed couldn't predict. She pulled the folded map from her pocket. Garber's map, worn soft at the creases already from how many times she'd opened it in the dark. She looked at it by the faint moonlight coming through the slats in the freight car wall. Found Caldwell Flats at the eastern edge. Found the street that Harriet Voss's wire had come from. Found the distance that was now finally shrinking. Tell me about Harriet Voss, she said. Ethan was sitting across from her on another crate, his back straight, his hat in his hands. He'd been watching the slats, watching the dark outside. She understood reading it for movement and sound, the way he read everything. He looked at her when she spoke. I know her by reputation, he said. She's been in Caldwell Flats for 20 years. Before that, some say she was a circuit attorney's assistant in Denver. Before that, nobody seems to know. He turned his hat in his hands. She helped 4 women get out of bad situations in the last 5 years that I know of personally. Not just shelter, she got 2 of them legal standing in property disputes. One of them is now running her own cattle operation east of Caldwell Flats. She knows the law. She knows how to work around the parts of the law that weren't written for people like us, he said carefully. Which is most of it. Clara absorbed this. May said the Temperance Society is a cover for other things she runs. That's the polite version. He looked at her directly. The less polite version is that Harriet Voss has been collecting information about corrupt land dealings in this county for a decade. She has contacts at the territorial governor's office. She has a friend at the Denver newspaper who has published 3 stories in the last 2 years about land fraud in the region. He paused. If what you know about the Clearwater Spring parcel is what I think it is, if your father has been manipulating title disputes and killing lawyers who got inconvenient, Harriet Voss has been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. Clara felt the weight of it settle over her. What she knew. What she'd seen in those accounts for 10 seconds at the end of August. The parcel number. The payment to Harlan Cross. The timeline that put Reed on her father's payroll 3 weeks before the evictions in Dry Creek Hollow. It felt at once enormous and desperately fragile. 10 seconds of reading. 3 digits of a parcel number she hadn't even been trying to memorize. A dead attorney. A pattern she'd assembled over the course of a single terrible day. What if it's not enough? She said. He looked at her steadily. What do you mean? What if what I saw, what I remember, isn't enough? I didn't read the whole document. I didn't copy the parcel number down. I don't have the ledger. I have my word that I saw something in my father's accounts, and my father is Thomas Whitmore, and I'm his daughter, who he just cast out for dishonoring the family. She felt the cold of it land clearly, the way cold landed at 2 in the morning. Who is going to believe me? The train rocked through the dark. Through the slats, she could see the flat land moving, the occasional light of a distant farmhouse, the stars very clear and cold above the open country. Ethan didn't answer immediately. She gave him the time for it. Harriet Voss will believe you, he said. Not because you're sympathetic, and not because your father is powerful, and not because of anything, except that she's been building a case, and you're a piece of it she didn't have yet. He held her gaze. And because 2 men on horseback and a rifle on a ridge, and Cal Reed at full pace across 3 counties, isn't what a man sends after a 19-year-old girl who just wrote an impertinent letter to a land office. She heard it, the logic of it, the evidence of it. The resources her father had deployed since 4:30 in the morning told their own story. Innocent men didn't chase their daughters through the dark with hired rifles. He's scared, she said slowly. Not of her, she had never made Thomas Whitmore scared in her life. He's scared of what I might remember. Yes. And the more men he sends after me, the more it looks like someone who has something to hide. Ethan nodded once. Everything he does tonight is evidence. Every dollar he spends on Reed, every rider he puts on the road. If Harriet gets it in front of the right people, the pursuit is as damning as the land deal. Clara looked at the slats of the freight car wall. At the dark moving past them. At the east, which was getting closer by the minute. The cold steel of the tracks carrying them toward something that might be, if they were fast enough and lucky enough and careful enough, something that looked like justice. She thought about the 12 families in Dry Creek Hollow. She thought about Garber's neighbor and the note on his door. She thought about Harlan Cross and a horse he'd ridden for 12 years. Something hardened in her that had been soft all day. Not anger exactly, or not just anger. Resolve. The specific kind of resolve that comes from a person who has finished grieving and started deciding. She had spent the day running. She had spent the day surviving. Both of those things had been correct and necessary. But she was done being only the thing that was being chased. When we get to Harriet, she said, I need paper, and I need an hour to write down everything I remember before any of it fades. The parcel number, the payment amount, the date in the ledger. Reed's name, the timeline. She paused. Everything. Harriet will have paper. And I need... She stopped. Started again because the next thing required her to say it clearly. I need to file a formal statement with the county clerk in Caldwell Flats. A legal document, my name on it. Everything I know. She looked at him. If something happens to me, there needs to be a record that can't be made to disappear. He was very still. Nothing is going to happen to you. I know you believe that, she said. And she did know it. She knew he believed it, the same way he'd believed she'd be fine with that steady, committed weight. But I grew up in Thomas Whitmore's house. I know how he manages problems. The record needs to exist before he has any more opportunities to manage this one. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. She saw something move through his expression, not doubt, not fear, something that looked more like the adjustment a person makes when they realize the person in front of them is not who they thought, or rather, is more than they knew. All right, he said. All right. You're right, he said simply. The record first. Everything else second. The train began to slow. She felt it before she understood it, the gradual change in rhythm, the subtle pull against forward motion. She looked at Ethan. Grazer's Crossing, he said. He was already on his feet, moving to the slats, looking out. She stood up and came beside him and looked through the narrow gap at the dark outline of a small town coming up alongside them. Buildings, a water tower, a platform with a single lantern lit. The freight slowed further, dropping to a crawl. She could hear voices outside, indistinct, the normal sounds of a crew stop. And then another sound. Hoofbeats. 2 horses coming in fast from the west. Ethan stepped back from the slats and put one hand on her arm, not grabbing just there, a point of contact in the dark. She pressed back against the crates, and they both stood completely still, not breathing more than they had to, while the freight car rocked gently to a stop, and the voices outside got louder. She heard a man's voice she didn't recognize, authoritative, directed at the crew. Asking about passengers. She heard the crew foreman say there were no passengers on the freight, which was true in the technical and completely irrelevant sense of the word. A pause. The sound of someone walking alongside the cars. The scrape of boots on gravel just outside. She could see the flicker of a hand lantern through the slats moving along the length of the train. The lantern stopped at their car. She felt Ethan move slightly beside her. Not retreat, the opposite of retreat. A subtle shift in his stance that she recognized as a man deciding he will not be found from a position of waiting. The lantern moved on. She let out a breath so carefully it made no sound. The voices outside continued for another 30 seconds. Then the crew foreman said something short and final. The voices dropped. The hoofbeats moved away, not east, back west. Whoever had been checking the train was satisfied, or had given up, or had been told something convincing. The train lurched and began to move again. Clara didn't speak until the sounds of Grazer's Crossing had fully receded and the train was back at speed and the dark was complete around them again. Then she sat back down on the crate and put her hands flat on her knees and made herself breathe normally. That was Reed, she said, or one of his men. Ethan sat across from her again. His face was composed, but his jaw held a tightness she'd learned to read over the course of the day. He knows we didn't come through Grazer's Crossing on the road. He was checking alternate routes. He's smart. I said that in Millhaven. You said Reed was smarter than Dawson. She looked at him. What I mean is, he's not going to stop. No, Ethan said. He won't. Which means even when we get to Harriet Voss, even when I've filed the statement, Reed is still out there. Yes? And my father is still in Red Hollow making decisions. Yes. She held that. The train moved east in the dark. 3 hours roughly to Caldwell Flats. 3 hours, and the thing that had been pursuing her all day would still be behind her, unchanged in its fundamental nature, just temporarily outpaced. Ethan. She said it quietly. He looked at her. Why does any of this matter to you? She asked it the way she'd asked it at the fence post and in May's kitchen, because she kept asking it, and the answer she got kept revealing a new surface she hadn't seen before. You had a job. You had wages. You had a life that didn't involve any of this. He was quiet for a long moment. The train rocked. The dark moved past the slats. 3 years ago, he said. I was working south of the Colorado border. There was a family woman and her 2 sons running a small cattle operation after her husband died. A land company wanted their water rights. They made the woman an offer. She said no. A week later there was a fire. He stopped. The house burned. Nobody was hurt, but everything in it was gone, including every deed and title document she owned. The land company made another offer 2 days later. He turned his hat in his hands, a slow rotation that had become familiar to her over the course of the day. She took it. She had no choice. She and her boys moved to her sister's house in Denver, and that was the end of a cattle operation her husband had spent 15 years building. He looked up. I watched that happen, he said. I was working cattle 3 miles from that family. I watched it happen and I told myself it wasn't my business. He paused. I have thought about that woman every single week for 3 years. Clara looked at him. You wrote a letter, he said. You put your name on it. 19 years old in your father's house knowing what it would cost you, and you put your name on it. He held her gaze without apology. I spent 3 years not putting my name on anything. I reckon this is what fixing that looks like. She did not look away. She let the full weight of what he'd said land, without deflecting it, without minimizing it, without offering the kind of gracious diminishment that would have been easier for both of them. Thank you for telling me that, she said. He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He went back to watching the slats. She sat in the dark freight car with the brass compass in her hands and the train carrying her east and thought about a woman in Denver and her 2 sons and a cattle operation that was gone, and she thought about 12 families in Dry Creek Hollow, and she thought about Harlan Cross falling from a horse he'd ridden for 12 years. She thought about her father at the head of the table with his hands flat on the wood and his quiet, careful voice explaining that she had failed. She thought about what she was going to write when Harriet Voss put paper in front of her. She was still thinking about it when the train's rhythm changed again, a subtle shift, a change in the quality of the sound, the beginning of a deceleration so gradual it was almost not there yet, but it was there. She looked at Ethan. That's not Caldwell Flats, he said. We're still an hour out. Then why? The train lurched. Hard. The kind of lurch that isn't a scheduled stop, but a sudden application of brakes, the kind that sends cargo sliding and sets every loose thing in the car moving. Clara grabbed the crate beside her and held on and felt Ethan's hand come across in the dark and grip her arm, steadying her. And then the train came to a shuddering grinding, fully unscheduled stop in the middle of absolute darkness, with no platform and no lights and no indication of what had put them here. Silence. Then from outside voices. Multiple voices. Not crew voices, the wrong cadence, the wrong register. The sound of men who were not waiting for the train to stop, but had made it stop. Ethan was already at the slats. Clara was beside him in 3 steps, looking through the narrow gap, and what she saw in the moonlight outside the freight car stopped the breath in her chest completely. 4 riders, spread across the track ahead of the engine. One of them holding a lantern, 3 of them with rifles, and at the center of them sitting his horse with the loose professional ease of a man for whom this kind of situation was simply work. A man she hadn't seen yet today, but recognized immediately from the way Ethan had gone completely still beside her. Reed had not gone back west. Reed had gotten ahead of them. He knew, Ethan said. His voice was very controlled. He knew we'd take the freight. Someone at Miller's Junction. The night man, Clara said. Her voice came out steady. She was surprised by that. He was Whitmore's too. Or Reed paid him tonight. Doesn't matter now. He turned from the slats and faced her in the dark. His expression was clear and direct, and entirely without panic, which she found in this specific moment to be one of the most useful things about him. There's a side door in the rear of this car. We go out the back north side away from the riders. They'll hear us. Yes, which means we move the second we open the door and we don't stop. He looked at her knee without looking at it. She understood what he was not saying. Can you run? She thought about the woman in Denver, the 2 sons. 15 years of work turned to ash. She thought about Harlan Cross. She thought about the 12 families in Dry Creek Hollow who had nowhere to go in the winter. "Yes," she said. "Then let's go." They moved to the rear of the car. Outside, Reed's voice carried through the freight car walls. Not words yet. Directions to the crew, the calm, authoritative voice of a man who has done this before and expects cooperation and usually gets it. Clara heard the crew foreman's voice answer, heard the conciliatory tone of a man who is not paid enough to argue with rifles. Ethan's hand found the side door latch in the dark. Clara gripped the compass in her left hand so hard the edge bit into her palm. The latch turned. The door came open. The cold night air hit her like a wall, and she went through it running. She hit the ground running, and her knee gave way on the second stride. Not completely. It didn't buckle, didn't drop her, but it folded wrong, and the pain that shot up her leg was the kind that lived past pain and became something closer to white noise. A signal so loud it stopped being specific and became general, became simply the condition of moving. She kept moving. She had decided she would keep moving, and the knee was going to have to manage that on its own terms. Ethan was 2 strides ahead of her, and he heard the change in her gait. Without looking back, she knew he heard it because he slowed exactly enough to come alongside her without making it a rescue, without making it the kind of thing that required her to accept help. He just appeared beside her and matched her pace, and they ran north together into the dark country off the tracks. While behind them, Reed's voice rose sharply, and boots hit gravel, and someone shouted a direction. They had maybe 30 seconds before the riders came around the train. The ground north of the tracks was rough and uneven, and absolutely unpredictable in the dark. The kind of ground that punishes running because it changes under your feet without warning. Clara's left boot caught a rock shelf she hadn't seen, and she went down hard on her hands and one knee, the bad knee, and the pain was spectacular and immediate, and she was back on her feet before Ethan finished turning around. "I'm up," she said, not asking, telling. He turned back around and kept running. Behind them, hoofbeats. One rider coming north of the train moving fast, cutting off the open ground between them and whatever darkness lay ahead. One rider from the south side angling to box them. The geometry of it was bad and getting worse, and Clara understood it the same way she'd understood every bad geometry today clearly, without sentimentality, with the specific focus of someone who has learned that panic is expensive. "The creek bed," Ethan said. Sharp low. 30 yards straight ahead. She couldn't see it. She trusted the direction. They covered 30 yards in a run that felt like it lasted a week, and then the ground dropped away, and they were in it. A dry creek bed deeper than the one she'd fallen into that morning, with steep sides that put them below the sightline of anyone on horseback. They went flat against the near bank without discussing it. Hoofbeats above them. Close. The rider coming north pulled up. She could hear the horse shifting the creak of saddle leather. The rider listening. The way Reed's men all seemed to listen with the professional patience of people who were paid to find things that didn't want to be found. She did not breathe. Beside her in the dark. Ethan was equally still. His shoulder was against hers, not deliberately, just the geometry of the creek bed. The two of them pressed against the same bank. She could feel him breathing through that contact point, slow and controlled. The rider moved south, rejoined the others. She heard Reed's voice again, quieter now, too far to make out words, and then a silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of communication. "He's thinking," she whispered. "He's good at it," Ethan whispered back. "He knows we're off the train." "Yes, but he doesn't know which direction." A pause. "He'll split them again. One east along the tracks, one north, one back west. He'll assume we're on foot and cover the distances accordingly." "We are on foot." "Yes." His voice was very dry. "That's the part he's right about." Clara looked east along the creek bed, the direction it ran a pale line in the dark, going toward whatever was ahead. She did the math. 1 hour out of Caldwell Flats when the train stopped. Running through rough country at night with a bad knee. She had no horse, no train, no road, no trail that Reed's people didn't already know about. She had a compass pointing east, a creek bed running roughly in that direction, and Ethan Cole. "How far does this creek run?" she asked. "I don't know." "Guess." He thought for a second. Creeks this size in this region usually run 2 to 5 miles before they hit something bigger or dry out completely. If it runs east, and we follow it. We stay below, sightline the whole way, he said, already seeing it. If it runs even close to east, we gain distance without giving them a horizon to search. And when it runs out, we deal with that when it runs out. She nodded. Good enough. She pushed off the bank and started moving east in the creek bed, staying low, picking her way by moonlight and instinct, one hand trailing the bank beside her. Ethan came behind her close enough that she could hear him, but not so close that he was crowding her movement. They moved like that for 40 minutes. The creek ran east-southeast, which was better than she'd hoped. It twisted and doubled back twice and dropped into a section that was rocky enough to require real care in the dark. But it ran, and they followed it, and the hoofbeats above them stayed distant and eventually stopped entirely, which was either because Reed had abandoned the search for the night or because he'd gone quiet, and that was somehow worse. She didn't let herself decide which. When the creek bed shallowed out and finally gave up against a long flat rise of ground, Clara stopped and checked the compass. East-southeast, consistent with where the creek had brought them. She looked up at the stars she'd learned to read them from a ranch hand named Collie when she was 12. One of the many things she'd learned from people who worked for her father rather than from her father himself. She found the North Star and oriented. We're maybe 4 miles out, she said. If I'm reading it right. You're reading it right. He came up beside her and looked where she was looking. There. He pointed slightly south of where she'd been looking. You see that dark line against the sky? That's the ridge on the west side of Caldwell Flats. The town sits in the valley behind it. She saw it. A long, low darkness against the lighter dark of the horizon. 3 or 4 miles. On foot. Through open country with riders she could no longer hear. Can we make that before sunrise? She asked. If we move. They moved. The next hour was the hardest of the day. Not because the terrain was the worst, the open ground was easier than the creek bed, but because the body has a limit, and Clara had reached hers somewhere around mile 2 of the creek bed and had been operating on the other side of it ever since. Her knee was no longer sending individual pain signals. It had simply become a grinding constant companion, like walking with a stone in her boot that she couldn't reach. She didn't mention it. She didn't slow her pace. She kept the ridge in her peripheral vision, and she kept moving, and she used every trick she knew, counting breaths, watching the stars, reciting the contents of her father's ledger page in her head, to keep her mind from settling into the pure animal misery of the situation. Ethan didn't try to talk her through it. He just stayed beside her. That was the right thing to do, and she registered it without comment and kept walking. They were a mile out from the ridge when the rider appeared. Not from behind them. From the east. From ahead. A single rider coming west out of Caldwell Flats, moving at a pace that was purposeful, without being frantic. Coming straight at them across the open ground in the pre-dawn dark. Clara stopped. Ethan stopped. There was nowhere to go. The creek bed was half a mile behind them, and the ground around them was flat, and the rider had already seen them, or was about to, and running would only confirm position without improving it. So she stood still and waited, and watched the rider come. The rider pulled up 15 feet from them. A woman. 60 maybe, with a straight back and a face that the moonlight showed as angular and deliberate. The face of someone who had spent a long time making decisions other people found difficult. She wore a dark coat and no hat, and her gray hair was pinned up with the practical efficiency of a woman who doesn't spend time on her hair when there are other things to attend to. She looked at Clara. She looked at Ethan. She looked at Clara's knee, or where her knee was, with the quick assessment of someone who has come looking for a specific person, and is confirming she has found them. "You're Clara Whitmore," the woman said. Not a question. "Yes." "May's wire said you were on the Friday freight. The freight is stopped 3 miles back." She looked at Ethan. "And you're Cole?" "Yes, ma'am." "May mentioned you too." Her tone was neutral on this, which somehow conveyed everything it needed to convey. "I'm Harriet Voss. I came out when the freight didn't arrive on time." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper. "Before we go any further, I need you to read this." Clara took the paper. She unfolded it in the moonlight and read it. It was short, 4 sentences. Her hands went very still. She read it again. "When did this come?" she said. Her voice came out different than she expected, stripped of something flatness under it that hadn't been there before. 2 hours ago, by telegraph from Red Hollow. Harriet watched her face. "I'm sorry." Clara folded the paper carefully. She folded it the way you fold something you are going to keep, not because you want it, but because it is real, and reality requires witness. She put it in her coat pocket next to the compass. Ethan was watching her. "What is it?" She looked at him. "My father filed a legal complaint with the county sheriff in Red Hollow," she said. "An hour after I left this morning, he filed a complaint stating that I stole from him before I left. Money from the household accounts." She paused. $11.40. The silence was very complete. "His exact amount," Ethan said. "My own savings," she said. 2 years of setting aside whatever I could from what he gave me for household expenses. In my own name, in my own purse." She heard her voice doing the thing voices do when they are working very hard to stay level. "He filed it as theft, which means there is now a county warrant for my arrest." She watched Ethan understand what that meant. She watched it land not the surface of it, the legal inconvenience, but the architecture of it. The genius of it, in the cold, terrible way that genuinely calculated moves are genius. Thomas Whitmore had turned his daughter from a runaway into a criminal. Anyone who helped her now was harboring a fugitive. Any statement she made to any official was made by a person under active warrant. Any evidence she presented was evidence from a suspect. He had outmaneuvered her before she even reached Caldwell Flats. Harriet Voss was watching her with those angular, deliberate eyes. Not with pity. Clara would have found pity difficult to manage right now. With the measuring attention of someone taking a full accounting before making a decision. "He's done this before," Harriet said. Not to Clara specifically. To the air in the tone of a woman confirming a hypothesis. "To a woman named Ruth Okafor 3 years ago. Filed a theft complaint after she left her husband's property with her own clothing. The complaint was eventually dismissed, but it took 8 months and cost her everything she had in legal fees." She looked at Clara. "Your father knows this playbook." "He wrote the playbook," Clara said. Harriet nodded. "Then you know what it's designed to do." "Make me appear before I can speak." Clara looked at her. "The moment I file a statement, I'm a person under warrant filing a statement, not a witness, a defendant." "In Red Hollow County, yes." Harriet's voice was measured. "In Red Hollow County with a sheriff who plays poker with your father, yes." She paused. "We are not in Red Hollow County." Something in the way she said it made Clara focus. "Caldwell Flats is Mercer County," Harriet continued. "The sheriff here is a man named Dale Pruitt. He is not my friend. He is not anyone's friend particularly, but he is also not Thomas Whitmore's man. He is simply a sheriff who follows the law as written and does not take well to outside jurisdictions, telling him how to run his county." She met Clara's eyes. A warrant issued in Red Hollow County is not automatically enforceable in Mercer County, particularly if the warrant is contested on the grounds that the property in question was demonstrably the claimant's own. Can that be contested? With the right documentation, bank records if they exist, letters, witnesses. She looked at Clara steadily. "May Driscoll knows your circumstances. I have correspondence from the women I've helped that demonstrates this pattern of complaint is a known tactic." She paused. "It can be contested. It takes time. But right now tonight in Mercer County, you are not under arrest." Clara let out a breath. Not relief. There was nothing simple enough in this situation for relief. But a window where there had been a wall. "Reed is 3 miles back," Ethan said to Harriet. "I know. I saw the riders when I came out." She turned her horse. "Then we should move. I have a house in town and a lock on the door, and Dale Pruitt doesn't answer calls from hired men at 4 in the morning on principle." She looked at Clara. "Can you ride?" Clara looked at Harriet's horse. A solid animal built for work with enough back for 2. She thought about her knee. She thought about Reed 3 miles behind them, and Thomas Whitmore's legal machinery already in motion, and the fact that the sun was going to come up in approximately 2 hours, and everything that was invisible in the dark would become visible. "Yes," she said. Harriet reached down. Clara took the hand and got up behind her, one smooth movement that cost her more than she showed, and settled. Ethan looked at the horse, at the two of them, at the 3 miles of open ground between them and Caldwell Flats. "I'll keep pace," he said, not asking. Harriet looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, the first softening Clara had seen from her small and brief. "You'll have to be fast," she said. "I know." They moved. Harriet pushed the horse into a canter, and Clara held on with her hands at Harriet's waist, and kept her bad leg from the stirrup, and watched the ridge getting closer, and listened for hoofbeats behind them. Ethan ran. She hadn't known he could run like that, the long, economical stride of a man who has spent years in rough country and understands how to move in it, but he kept pace with the horse, or close enough to it, across the flat ground toward the ridge. Nobody came from behind. Either Reed had pulled back for the night, or he'd lost them completely, or he was doing something else entirely. Something she couldn't predict, which was the option that frightened her most. They crossed the ridge and came down into Caldwell Flats as the first gray suggestion of dawn was beginning to separate the sky from the land. Harriet's house was on the east end of town, set back from the main street, with a heavy front door and shuttered windows, and a garden that had the organized, purposeful look of everything else Harriet Voss touched. She had them inside in under 2 minutes, the door locked, a lamp lit on the kitchen table. Clara sat down in the first chair she reached and stayed there. Ethan came in 30 seconds behind them, breathing hard but controlled, and closed the door and leaned against it with his hands on his knees for a moment, and then straightened up. Harriet went to a cabinet and came back with paper and inkwell and 2 pens. She set them in front of Clara without ceremony. "Write," she said. "Everything. The parcel number, the payment, the dates, the names. Every conversation you had with your father in the last month that is relevant. Every name connected to Reed that you know." She put her hands flat on the table. "Write it all before you sleep, before you eat, before you do anything else. Because when morning comes, your father is going to be doing the same thing, writing his version of this story, and whoever gets their version to the right people first has the advantage." Clara picked up the pen. She looked at the blank paper. She thought about Thomas Whitmore at the head of the table. The flat hands. The quiet voice. The 30 years of a man building something by deciding that other people's lives were resources to be managed. She thought about Harlan Cross. She thought about 12 families. She started writing. She wrote for 45 minutes without stopping. Harriet sat across from her and didn't speak and didn't interrupt and refilled her coffee when it went cold without being asked. Ethan sat in the chair against the wall with his eyes open and his hands quiet in his lap, and watched the room and let her work. She wrote in the direct, specific language of the household accounts she'd kept for 2 years, dates, amounts, names, sequences. She wrote without emotion and without embellishment, because she understood instinctively that the most powerful document was the one that read like a ledger, not like a grievance. She wrote the parcel number. She wrote the payment to Harlan Cross. She wrote Reed's name and the date she believed he'd been contracted. She wrote the conversation at the dinner table, verbatim the exact words she remembered. She wrote the bolt hitting the frame at 4:47 in the morning. When she finished, she set the pen down and looked at the pages. 6 of them, her handwriting small and precise, the way she'd been trained to write for accounts. Harriet picked them up. She read them the way a lawyer reads something, not for narrative, but for structure, checking each claim against the next, looking for gaps and inconsistencies and places where the record needed support. She read without expression. Then she set the pages down and looked at Clara. "This is enough to open an investigation," she said. Clara heard it land. "This is not a certainty," Harriet continued in the measured tone of a person who does not trade in false hope. "Thomas Whitmore has money and connection and a legal complaint already filed against you. Any investigation will be contested. It will be slow. It will be ugly." She paused. "But this," she pressed her hand flat on the pages, "this is enough to get it started. And once an investigation is started, the things your father does to stop it become evidence of their own. Like the writers, Ethan said from his chair. Like the writers. Like the warrant filed on the morning she left. Like the pattern of complaints against women who've left properties under his influence. Harriet looked at Clara. The Clearwater Spring parcel is key. If he's maneuvering to control the water rights for the northeast quarter of this county, there are 8 ranch families who have standing to bring complaint alongside yours. 8 families are not one fugitive daughter. 8 families are a case. Can you reach them? Clara asked. I know 3 of them personally. Harriet stood up. I'll wire the others before noon. She moved toward the hallway and stopped. She turned back and looked at Clara with an expression that Clara couldn't entirely categorize, something between recognition and something older than recognition. The look of a woman seeing something she has been watching for a long time. You did a brave thing this morning, Harriet said, writing that letter to the land office, before you knew any of this. I wrote it because it was right, Clara said. I know, that's what makes it brave. She paused. Brave is easy to talk about. It's very hard to do when you're still inside the house. She went down the hallway. Clara sat at the table with the empty pages in front of her, and the lamp making its small, warm circle, and the sound of the town outside beginning its early morning movement, a cart, a dog, a door somewhere on the main street. The ordinary sounds of a world going on. She was so tired she could feel it in her teeth. Ethan got up from his chair and came to the table. He sat down across from her and put his hands flat on the table, the same way her father always did, and then seemed to realize what he'd done, and shifted his hands to his coffee cup, and she almost said something about it, and didn't, because the moment was too full already for that. It's not over, she said. No. He's not going to stop because I filed a statement. No, he's going to escalate. He looked at her honestly, the way he looked at everything. The warrant is just the first move. When he finds out you made it to Harriet Voss and put 6 pages in front of her, he'll do something else. What? I don't know yet. He paused. But I'll tell you what I do know. She looked at him. He sent Reed. Reed is good. Reed got ahead of us on the railroad and stopped the freight and had men on 3 compass points at midnight. He held her gaze. And you're still here. You're in Harriet Voss's kitchen with 6 pages on the table and a case that she says is enough to open an investigation. He paused. That means something. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them. The pages. The compass on the table beside her coffee cup, its needle pointing steadily at whatever east meant from inside this kitchen. She thought about what he'd said in the freight car. About the woman in Denver. About 3 years of thinking about it. She thought about May at the boarding house door, watching them go with her arms crossed and her mouth set and no ceremony. She thought about Garber spreading his hand-drawn map on the kitchen table at 11 at night, a man with no obligation and a clear-eyed understanding of the cost. She thought about all the people who had opened a door today without being asked to. Why do people do that? She said. Not quite to Ethan. More to the room, to the question itself. May. The Garbers. The nightman who led us into the freight car. Harriet riding out in the dark at 4 in the morning. She looked at her hands on the table. They don't owe me anything. Ethan was quiet for a moment. No, he said. They don't owe you specifically anything. He turned his coffee cup. But they're all carrying something that happened to someone before you. Something they didn't stop when they could have. Something they've been waiting for a way to act on. He looked at her. You gave them the occasion. That's not nothing. That's how things change. She held that. The idea of it. Not that she was the center of it. Not that the story was about her specifically, but that she was the occasion. The moment when accumulated private grievance found a public form. The letter to the land office. Written alone in her room with the door closed and her father's voice in the hallway. The most frightened she'd ever been in her life up to that morning. She'd written it anyway. Outside the sky was beginning to show the first real light of dawn. Not the gray suggestion she'd seen at the ridge, but actual light, the kind that meant morning was arriving whether or not anyone was ready for it. She was not ready for it. She was going to meet it anyway. She pulled the compass toward her and looked at the needle. It pointed east into the light coming under the shutters, into the morning, into whatever Thomas Whitmore's next move was going to be, and whatever Harriet Voss's network could do about it, and whatever the sheriff of Mercer County thought of warrants filed in jurisdictions run by men who played poker together on Thursday nights. The lamp flickered. Outside, a rooster somewhere decided it was time. Then footsteps came fast down Harriet's hallway. Not Harriet's measured stride, someone moving quickly, and Clara was on her feet before she knew she'd stood up, the chair scraping back. Ethan already turned toward the door, and Harriet came through it with a paper in her hand, and an expression that was the first uncontrolled thing Clara had seen on her face all morning. "A wire just came," Harriet said. She set it on the table. Clara read it. It was from Abel Price. Abel Price, who had knocked on her bedroom door at 4 in the morning with a lantern, and the roughened voice of a man whose shame had finally found its limit. Abel Price, who had watched things happen for 20 years and told himself it wasn't his place. The wire said 6 words and a name. Cross kept copies. "I have them. Abel." Clara read it twice. The room was very still. Then she looked at Ethan, who had read it over her shoulder, and she watched his face do the thing that faces do when the mathematics of a situation changes completely. The brief involuntary recalibration, the moment between what was true before and what is true now. Harlan Cross had kept copies of everything, and Abel Price had them. "He was waiting," Clara said. Her voice came out almost wondering. "He's been waiting for someone to give him a reason." Harriet was already moving back toward the hallway. "I need to wire back immediately. If Abel has Cross's copies, we need them here before your father realizes what Abel has done." She stopped in the doorway. "How fast can your father move when he's frightened?" Clara looked at her. "Faster than you'd think," she said, "and with less mercy." Harriet nodded once. She went to send the wire. Clara stood at the kitchen table with the morning coming under the shutters, and Abel Price's 6 words in front of her, and 2 years of her own careful, terrified, necessary writing behind her, and she understood with the full, clear, unglamorous understanding of someone who has just watched the thing they were fighting for become real, that the day was not over. It was just starting. And this time, she was not the one who was behind. Harriet's wire to Abel went out at 5:47 in the morning. The reply came back in 11 minutes, which meant Abel had been sitting at the telegraph office in Red Hollow, waiting for it. Had been there, Clara realized, since before Harriet's first wire, since before any of them knew he was going to act. Abel Price had made his decision before anyone asked him to. That was the detail that undid something in her chest that had been held tight since 4:30 the previous morning. The reply said, "Writing now. Caldwell Flats by noon. Keep her there." Harriet read it and set it on the table and looked at Clara with the measured expression of someone recalculating odds. 8 hours, she said. "We have 8 hours before Abel arrives, and this becomes something your father cannot quiet with a warrant." "And Reed," Ethan said. "Reed is still in this county." Harriet moved to the window, didn't open the shutter, just stood near it, listening to the town outside, finding its morning pace. "He won't come to my door in daylight. Not in Caldwell Flats, not without a legal instrument, and the warrant is a Red Hollow document." She paused. "But he will watch the road. He will be at every entry point into this town looking for Abel." Clara understood it immediately. "He doesn't know Abel is coming. Not yet, but he will. Your father will wake up this morning and find his foreman gone, and he will know exactly what Abel has done." She looked at Clara. "How long before your father figures it out and wires Reed?" Clara thought about Thomas Whitmore waking up. The routine of it: breakfast at 6, accounts at 7, foreman's report at 7:30. 7:30, she said. "Maybe 8 o'clock. He'll go looking for Abel at the morning report." Harriet looked at the clock on the wall. 6:15. "We have between 90 minutes and 2 hours before Reed knows to watch for Abel on the road." Ethan stood up. He'd been sitting in the chair against the wall for the last 20 minutes, and he had the stillness of someone who had been deciding something without announcing it. He looked at Harriet. "Which road does Abel take from Red Hollow?" "The county road north and then east. Same road Clara came in on." "That runs through Grazer's Crossing," he said. Yes. Where Tillis runs the livery. He looked at Clara. If Tillis sees Abel coming through on a hard ride east this early, he won't need to wait for a wire from Whitmore. He'll contact Reed directly, Clara said. Within minutes. The room went quiet with the weight of it. Harriet clasped her hands in front of her with the manner of someone converting alarm into logistics. Abel needs to avoid Grazer's Crossing entirely. He needs to know that before he gets there, Ethan said. Which means someone needs to reach him on the road before he hits the crossing. He looked at Harriet. Can you wire ahead to any point between Red Hollow and Grazer's Crossing? There's a station at Pony Creek, 8 miles east of Red Hollow, 15 miles west of Grazer's Crossing. She was already moving toward the hallway. If the station man gets the message to someone who can intercept Abel on the road, wire Pony Creek, Ethan said. Tell them to stop any rider coming east from Red Hollow and send him south of Grazer's Crossing. There's a route through the Garber property. Abel knows it. He's ridden that country for 20 years. Harriet looked at him for a moment with those sharp evaluating eyes. Then she went down the hallway. Clara looked at Ethan across the kitchen table. You've been planning that since the wire came, she said. I've been thinking about the roads since Grazer's Crossing, he said. Abel changes what's possible, but only if he gets here. He paused. Your father has more men than Reed. If he sends riders west instead of wiring ahead, he won't. Clara was certain of this the way she was certain of very few things about Thomas Whitmore. He'll wire. He manages things at a distance. He always has. He sends men so he doesn't have to go himself. She heard the bitterness of it in her own voice and let it stand there unvarnished. He has never once ridden out to do his own work. Ethan heard the thing underneath that and didn't comment on it directly. He said, Then we have the time. If the Pony Creek wire gets to Abel, it will. Harriet's voice came from the hallway closer than expected. She'd been listening while she wrote. She came back in with a third paper. The station man at Pony Creek is a man named George Fitch. I helped his sister 3 years ago. He owes me considerably more than a conversation with a passing rider. She set the paper down. The wire is sent. Clara looked at both of them. Harriet with her deliberate hands and her decades of accumulated knowledge about how power worked and how to work around it. Ethan with his road-worn patience and the quiet capability of a man who thinks in exits and contingencies. Two people who had no reason to be in this kitchen at 6 in the morning doing any of this. She thought about what he'd said in the freight car. I gave the occasion. She thought that was still the most honest description of what she had been in this story. Not the hero of it. Not the most capable person in it, but the occasion. The letter. The decision to put her name on something true and costly at 19 years old in her father's house. Everything else had grown from that. What do we do for the next 2 hours? She asked. Harriet looked at her. You sleep, she said, while you still can. Clara started to object, and Harriet held up one hand. Not a request. You have been awake for 26 hours, and you are going to need your mind working clearly when Abel arrives, and we go in front of Dale Pruitt with what we have. A person who can't think straight is a liability in a room with a skeptical sheriff. She pointed down the hallway. Second door. Sleep. Clara looked at Ethan. I was already leaning back in his chair with his eyes closing with the practiced ease of a man who had learned long ago to sleep in whatever window was offered and ask no questions about the mattress. She's right, he said without opening his eyes. Clara went down the hallway and found the second door and lay down on top of the covers in her mother's coat and was asleep in under 4 minutes. She dreamed about the bolt hitting the frame. She dreamed it over and over, the sound of it, that final hollow click, the lantern light going out. But in the dream, she wasn't on the porch. She was already walking, already going north. The sound happened behind her, and she didn't stop, and she didn't look back, and the road ahead of her just kept opening, mile after mile of it, clear and cold and entirely hers. Harriet woke her at 9:15 with a hand on her shoulder and a voice that had lost none of its composure, but had acquired a particular quality of urgency. Get up, Harriet said. Your father wired the county sheriff here. Not Pruitt wired the sheriff's office directly. Formal extradition request on the theft warrant. Clara was sitting up before Harriet finished the sentence. He found out about Abel. He found out about something. The wire came 40 minutes earlier than you predicted. Harriet handed her coffee a cup that had been prepared in the 30 seconds since she'd walked in, which said everything about the kind of person Harriet Voss was. He is faster than you thought. I told you he would be. She drank the coffee standing up. Has Pruitt responded? Pruitt is at his office. He has the extradition request. He has not yet responded, which is Pruitt's way of thinking before he acts, which is the only thing about Dale Pruitt I actually admire. She looked at Clara steadily. We need to get to him before he decides the easiest path is compliance. With what Abel's not here yet. With what you have. Harriet picked up the 6 pages from the kitchen table, Clara's handwritten statement, precisely what she'd written at 5 in the morning, and held them up. And with this, she pulled out a second document from beneath the pages. A printed letter, formal with a letterhead, Clara didn't immediately recognize. She took it and read the top line. The Denver Territorial Courier. The newspaper Harriet had mentioned in the freight car conversation, the one that had published 3 stories about land fraud in the region. You already sent them a wire, Clara said. I sent it while you were sleeping. They have a correspondent in Caldwell Flats. He'll be at Pruitt's office in an hour. Harriet's voice was measured, but there was something underneath it. The contained intensity of a woman who has been building toward this kind of moment for a very long time and is choosing to move carefully precisely because the stakes are high enough to require it. A sheriff who ignores an extradition request is making a political statement. A sheriff who ignores an extradition request while a Denver newspaper correspondent is taking notes is making a permanent record. Clara stared at her. You've been planning this since before I arrived. I've been planning for a situation like this for 6 years, Harriet said simply. You just gave me the occasion. There it was again. The occasion. Clara felt something settle in her. Not peace, exactly. Not with Reed, still in the county, and the extradition request on Pruitt's desk, and Abel still on the road, but clarity. The specific clarity of understanding your own function in a larger thing. Let's go, Clara said. Ethan was already at the front door when they came down the hallway. He'd found water somewhere and washed his face, and his hat was back on, and he looked like a man who was ready to walk into a room that was going to be difficult and stay in it as long as it took. They walked to Pruitt's office. The town was fully awake now. Morning traffic on the main street, the blacksmith going, a woman sweeping her shop front, who looked at the 3 of them as they passed with the alert interest of a person who can tell when something is about to happen. Clara walked with her knee wrapped tight and her mother's coat straight on her shoulders and her head up, and she thought about how 27 hours ago she had been standing on a porch in the dark, being erased, and how much distance there was between that moment and this one, and how every inch of that distance had been paid for in something real. Dale Pruitt was a compact man of 50, with a close-trimmed beard and the unhurried manner of someone who has learned that the people who rush him usually regret it. He was sitting at his desk with Thomas Whitmore's extradition request in front of him when they came in, and he looked at the 3 of them. Clara, Ethan, Harriet, with the measuring calm of a man who had been expecting at least some of this. Mrs. Voss, he said. Sheriff. She sat down across from him without being invited. Clara and Ethan stood. He looked at Clara. You're the Whitmore girl. My name is Clara Whitmore, she said. I'm no longer particularly the Whitmore anything, but that's the name, yes. He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression she couldn't fully read. Not sympathy. Something more like the professional attention of a man confronting a situation that is more complicated than the paperwork in front of him would suggest. Your father's filed a theft warrant out of Red Hollow County and an extradition request to my office. I know. You're contesting it. The $11.40 in question are 2 years of savings from my personal household allowance, she said. I kept every account record. The amounts were consistent with a personal savings pattern, not any irregularity in the household accounts. I can provide documentation. What documentation? I was the household accountant for 2 years. She put Harriet's copy of her written statement on his desk. I wrote down everything I remember this morning. The figures are there. He looked at the pages without picking them up. That's your word. Yes. And May Driscoll in Millhaven is prepared to provide a statement confirming my circumstances when I left. And Harriet Voss has documentation of this exact complaint pattern being used previously by— I know about the Okafor situation, Pruitt said. His voice was flat informational. He picked up Clara's pages and read the first two. He read slowly, which she took as a sign he was actually reading and not performing the act. He set them down. This other part, he said. The land parcel, the payment to Cross, that's a serious allegation. Yes. You have no documentation of the actual ledger entry. Not yet. She held his gaze. My father's foreman Abel Price is writing here now with copies that Harlan Cross kept before he died. Cross kept copies of everything according to Abel. She paused. Abel has worked for Thomas Whitmore for 20 years. He is not a person with an incentive to lie about his employer without a compelling reason. Pruitt looked at her. And what's his compelling reason? He watched something happen that he didn't stop, Clara said. For a long time. And then he decided he'd watched long enough. A silence settled in the office. Pruitt turned a pen in his fingers, slowly looking at the extradition request, and then at Clara's pages, and then at something on the wall that was neither of those things. Then the office door opened. A man came in young, quick-eyed with an ink stain on his left hand and a notebook under his arm that he was already opening. He looked at Pruitt. Sheriff. James Whitfield, Denver Territorial Courier. He looked at Clara. And you're Clara Whitmore. Pruitt looked at Harriet. Harriet looked back at him with an expression of complete serenity. Pruitt set his pen down. He looked at the extradition request on his desk. He looked at Clara's 6 pages. He looked at the correspondent from Denver with his open notebook. He took a long breath in the way of a man making a decision he will have to live with and has decided to make it deliberately rather than by default. I'm going to require additional verification before I act on the Red Hollow extradition request, he said. Standard procedure when the underlying complaint is contested. He looked at Clara. You'll stay in Caldwell Flats pending that verification. You're not under arrest, but you're not free to leave the county. Understood, Harriet said before Clara could speak. And if this Price shows up with what you say he's bringing, I want to see it before it goes anywhere else. He looked at Whitfield. And if you print something before I've had time to conduct a proper review, you and I are going to have a long conversation about interference. Of course, Sheriff, Whitfield said, and wrote something in his notebook with the air of a man for whom that answer meant very little. Pruitt stood up. He picked up the extradition request and held it for a moment, held it the way you hold something you're deciding the fate of. He put it in the top drawer of his desk. He did not file it. He did not act on it. He put it in the drawer, which was its own kind of answer. I'll expect to hear from you when Price arrives, he said to Harriet. You'll be the first, she said. They walked out. On the street. Clara stopped. She stood in the morning light of Caldwell Flats, with her knee aching and her mother's coat on her shoulders, and she breathed for a moment without any particular agenda. Just breathed and let the morning be the morning. Ethan came up beside her, not touching just there. Whitfield was already moving up the street with his notebook. Harriet was 3 steps ahead, already thinking 3 moves forward. He didn't act on it, Clara said. No, Ethan said. That's not the same as it being over. No, he agreed. It's not. She thought about what was still in motion. Reed, somewhere in the county watching roads. Her father in Red Hollow, calculating his next move, with the cold efficiency of a man who had been building his world, according to his own rules, for 30 years. The Clearwater Spring parcel, and the 12 families in Dry Creek Hollow, and Harlan Cross's death, and the question of whether any of this would ever reach the kind of formal reckoning that made it mean something beyond the people directly inside it. She thought about all of that, and she did not feel defeated by it. She felt the weight of it, which was different. At 11:42 a rider came into Caldwell Flats from the South Road, not the county road east, not through Grazer's Crossing, but from the south through the Garber route that Ethan had described and Pony Creek's George Fitch had presumably communicated. The rider was hard-used and trail-dirty and gray-bearded, and he pulled up in front of Harriet's house and got off his horse with the stiff, deliberate movement of a man of 60 who has ridden hard and is not going to admit it hurt. Abel Price looked at Clara for a long moment without speaking. She looked back at him. There was no ceremony for what was between them. There was no version of it that fit inside a clean moment. He had knocked on her door at 4 a.m. with a lantern and the roughened voice of a man following his employer's orders, and she had walked out of a house she was born in with $11.40 and her mother's coat. Those were the facts of yesterday morning, and they could not be unfactored. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was the same as always. Rough, direct, the voice of a man who doesn't manage what he says. "I should have..." He stopped. "I should have done a lot of things a lot sooner." "Yes," she said, not cruelly, just honestly, the way the moment required. He nodded. He reached into his coat and pulled out a wrapped oilcloth package tied with twine. He held it out. "Cross gave me these 3 weeks ago. He said if anything happened to him, I should know what to do with them." His jaw tightened. "I told myself he was being dramatic. I told myself it was nothing." He pushed the package toward her. It was not nothing. She took it. Inside the oilcloth was a stack of papers, legal documents, title records, correspondence, ledger copies. Harlan Cross's handwriting on several. Her father's signature on others. The parcel number she'd memorized from 10 seconds of reading in August there on the 3rd page, exactly where she'd known it would be. And beside it, the purchase price. And beside that, the name of the holding company. And behind that, a letter from Cross to an unnamed party, dated 6 days before his death, stating that he was unwilling to continue and that he intended to contact the territorial governor's office unless the matter was resolved. It was everything. Clara's hands were very still on the papers. "We need to go to Pruitt," she said. They went to Pruitt. The next 3 hours were not dramatic in the way that the previous 27 hours had been dramatic. They were the different kind of dramatic, the kind that happens in rooms with desks and documents and measured voices, the kind where the tension lives in the precise weight of words and the meaning of signatures and the question of which version of the truth a legal apparatus is willing to hold. Pruitt read Cross's documents twice alone in his office, while Clara and Ethan and Harriet and Abel sat in the outer room and waited. Whitfield from the Denver Courier sat across the street and waited in his own way. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Pruitt came out of his office. He looked at Clara. "I'm wiring the territorial governor's office this afternoon," he said. "And I'm withdrawing my consideration of the Red Hollow extradition request, pending investigation of the materials provided." He paused. "The theft warrant from Red Hollow is suspended in this jurisdiction as of now." Clara heard it arrive. She let it be real. "And Reed," Ethan said. Pruitt looked at him steadily. "Cal Reed and his associates are operating in this county without legal standing. I'll be advising them of that directly." He paused. "Today." "My father," Clara started. "Thomas Whitmore is a matter for the territorial investigation," Pruitt said. Not unkindly, but clearly. "That will take time. I won't pretend otherwise. These things always take time. But the materials you've provided, combined with Price's testimony and Cross's documentation, constitute a record that cannot be ignored." He held her gaze. "It will not be ignored." Harriet stood up. "Thank you, Sheriff." He nodded once and went back into his office and closed the door. Which was the most warmth Dale Pruitt apparently had available. They walked out into the afternoon. The town was at its midday pace. Unhurried, ordinary. The street carrying on its business with the complete indifference of places that contain large events inside ordinary days. Clara stood on the step of the sheriff's office and breathed air that tasted like dust and distance, and the particular relief of a thing that has shifted, not resolved, but shifted. Abel was standing near his horse. He had the look of a man who has done the thing he came to do, and is now confronting what comes next, which is the harder part for people who have been standing still for a long time. Clara walked over to him. "What will you do?" she asked. "Don't know," he said. "Can't go back to the ranch." He said it without self-pity, just the plain acknowledgement of a man who has closed a door behind him and knows it. "Reckon I'll figure it out." "May Driscoll in Mill Haven," Clara said. "Tell her I sent you. She'll give you a room while you work out the next thing." She paused. "She helps people figure out the next thing." He looked at her. Something moved through his face that was too complicated to name. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. He mounted up. He looked at her from the saddle for a moment, with the expression of a man who has more to say than he knows how to say. Then he touched his hat and rode north. She watched him go. Ethan came up beside her. Harriet was behind them, already in conversation with Whitfield, already managing the next thing, because Harriet Voss did not stop moving. Clara could hear the word record, and the word families, and the phrase 8 separate complaints, and she knew that by morning the story would have a shape in print that her father could not rewrite. "What do you do now?" Ethan said. She turned to look at him. He was asking it the same way she'd asked Abel, straightforwardly, without agenda, genuinely wanting to know. She thought about it. She thought about the ranch family east of Caldwell Flats that Harriet had mentioned. The woman Harriet had helped years ago, who was running her own cattle operation now. She thought about what Harriet had said about legal standing and property disputes, and how knowledge of the law was the difference between being subject to it and being able to use it. She thought about 2 years of keeping household accounts with the precision of a professional and 6 pages of written statement that Pruitt had read twice, and the fact that the territorial governor's office was going to receive a wire today from a Mercer County sheriff that contained her name attached to something real. She thought about the brass compass in her pocket pointing east, which it had been doing all day, regardless of what else was happening. "I'm going to stay in Caldwell Flats for now," she said. "Harriet said she knows an attorney who takes cases on credit. I want to understand what standing I have, what any of us have in the investigation. I want to be present for it." She paused. "I'm not running anymore." Ethan looked at her with those steady eyes. "And you," she said. Howe was quiet for a moment. The measured quiet that she had learned was not absence, but the opposite, the presence of someone who takes questions seriously enough to answer them honestly. "I said I was done with Whitmore's ranch before I saddled the gray," he said. "I meant that. Everything after that." He paused. "I'm still figuring out. But I know which direction feels right." She looked at him. East. The corner of his mouth moved in that brief, understated way she'd seen twice now. "East is a reasonable start." She took the compass out of her pocket. She held it between them for a moment, the small brass instrument that had been warm from his pocket when he'd pressed it into her hand at a fence post before sunrise yesterday, that had pointed her through Millhaven and the Garber Ranch, and a freight car in the dark, and a dry creek bed, and a sheriff's office in Caldwell Flats. She turned it in her fingers once. Then she put it back in her pocket. Not because she still needed it, the way she had needed it at 4:30 in the morning alone, and erased on a dark porch. But because some things you keep not for use, but for truth. Because they are the record of who you were when everything was against you and you walked north anyway. Thomas Whitmore had cast her out before sunrise. He had sent hired men and legal warrants and every instrument of a powerful man's power after her. He had tried to make her disappear back into his house, or out of the picture entirely, or into the clean, controlled silence that had always been his preferred version of a daughter. He had failed, not because Clara Whitmore was extraordinary, not because she had done everything right or been brave in any pure, uncomplicated way. She had been frightened, and she had been hurt, and she had fallen in a creek bed in the dark, and she had needed May Driscoll's kitchen and Garber's map, and a man with a compass at a fence post, and an old foreman who had waited too long and finally decided to stop waiting. She had needed all of that, and it had been there. That was the truth about freedom, that no one told you when you were young and living inside someone else's rules, that it was not a thing you found alone on a high ridge with the wind in your hair. It was a thing built out of ordinary people making ordinary decisions to open their doors when they didn't have to put their names on things, to ride out in the dark because someone needed them to. Clara Whitmore had written a letter, and the rest of it, all of it, every hard mile and close call and open door of it, had been the world deciding that some things mattered enough to answer. She stood in the afternoon light of Caldwell Flats, with Ethan Cole beside her, and Harriet Voss's voice carrying down the street, and the sheriff's wire already on its way to the territorial capital, and she looked east, which was where the compass pointed, and where the next thing was, and she breathed. She had not been given her freedom. She had walked towards it in the dark with borrowed tools and imperfect knowledge and more help than she'd known to ask for, and she had arrived. That was enough. That was everything.